Welcome, everybody. I'm going to go over some of the logistics for today's meeting. You can see the agenda on the screen right now. Got some exciting talks planned for today. Just a reminder, type your questions into the Zoom's Q&A box. Make sure that when you're typing a question, you put the speaker's name first so that we know who it is directed to. So if you have a question for our first speaker, Chris, you would type Chris and then type the rest of the question. Don't add questions into the chat. They'll be missed. Make sure you put them in the Q&A. You can use the chat for comments and discussion, and make sure you're talking to all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu, not just all panelists. For continuing education units, we have the Department of Pesticide Regulation for private applicators for PCAs. That's today. We have 3 hours in the other. Please note that there'll be poll questions that come up on the screen. You want to answer them to verify you're listening. Also, those questions will be on a quiz that is emailed to you after the event. Now, please keep in mind this email may not come until the end of the day today, 5 p.m. So don't worry if you don't get it in your inbox right away. It probably will take a few hours for you to get it. For Certified Crop Advisor, we do also have credits. There will be a QR code that comes up at the end of the day. You just need to scan it, or if you don't have the app on your phone, the Certified Crop Advisor app, you can just email us and I'll make sure to add you on the list. The email is down at the bottom. Last thing about DPR, California Department of Pesticide Regulation. If you do not want the credits, you do not have to take the test that's emailed to you. I had a few people take it on Monday, but they don't actually have a DPR license. So you don't have to take the test. It's just sent to everybody who attends so that those that want the credit for their license can get it. Okay, that's it. With that, I am going to turn it over to our moderator who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Kelly. Good morning and welcome to today's edition of the Pistachio Short Course. My name is Jalendra Rizal. I am Area IPM Advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension and the statewide IPM program. And here, today's seminar will cover basically the insect, vertebrate pest, and then weeds. And our first speaker today is Dr. Chris Toller. And the title of his talk is Mites and Insect Affecting Tree Establishment. So, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Jalendra. Can you hear me? You can,
Yes.
Okay. All right, let me share my screen. I share screen. Okay. All right, let's get going here. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about mites and insects that affect trees that are in their establishment phase. Obviously, this is very, very important given this information here. You can see that over the past 3 years, 2017, 18, and 19, there's about 83,000 acres of new plantings. And so that is a substantial amount. For those folks out there that have some of these acres, this talk is especially important. Now, just remember that information that I share with you today is readily available on the UCIPM website. So there's a lot of acres out there, and so it's important. With any crop, really. I mainly work in almonds and pistachios and pomegranates. And if any of you have seen my talks before, you've seen me put up a slide, the principles of integrated pest management. And it is especially important when we're talking about establishing pistachio trees. You can see effective pesticide use. We'll talk about some of that. Sampling, which is extremely important in new trees, and avoidance. There's certainly some avoidance out there. And if we're going to get to a sustainable production landscape, if you will, almond board talks a lot about it. Pistachio, it's a tall order sustainability, true sustainability. But if we're going to get there, integrated pest management is going to be our backbone, and that's what we're going to stand on. And I'm sure that a lot of you folks out there already do lots of integrated pest management, and it's pretty much in your DNA. So I commend you for that. My disclaimer, I don't have a photographic memory, so please read the label. I don't mention any pesticide common names, or rather trade names by their trade names, but if I happen to, I'm not endorsing any one pesticide. So please make sure that you read the label. Things change. I have kind of a laundry list of pests that can affect, in a bad way, establishing trees. And the first ones I like to talk about today are the soft scale. Those used to be called homopterans, and those were, the aphids were homopterans. You might remember that. I still see some of that today, but that's all bunched together into hemipterans. So that's ones with piercing, sucking mouth parts. They pierce in, and some of them are sessile. They just stay in one place for quite a while. The cottony cushion aphid, pardon me, the cotton aphid, of course, doesn't. They tend to migrate around, but these other ones, brown soft, black scale, frosted scale, fruit licinium, for most of their life, they're sessile. So they're pretty easy to monitor for. So they have the piercing, sucking mouth part. They poke in, they feed from the plant, the phloem. So they excrete sugary substance after they take out what they need. They excrete that sugary substance, and that is honeydew. So let's talk about, we're not going to talk about all of those species that I had in that previous slide, but this one here, black scale, is worth mentioning. But the adults about an 1/8 inch long. They're dark brown with a black H on their dorsum. They're pardon me, dark brown to black with an H on their dorsum, not a black H. So as I mentioned before, honeydew is one of the main indirect damages that they do. Direct damages that they just suck out the plant sap. So if you have lots of honeydew, it grows black sooty mold, reduction of photosynthesis. So you're getting kind of a double whammy here. So this is a very interesting past part of it. There's 2 generations in some parts of California. In the pistachio growing regions of California, there's just 1 generation. The crawlers come out in May and June. So you want to be aware of that. So how do you monitor for it? So in early to mid-January, and that time's coming up, you want to examine 1-year-old fruiting wood for live and parasitized scale. Now, parasitized scale are those ones that are dead, and that's on the right-hand bottom picture. It looks like a little igloo with an opening there, but those have been parasitized. A little wasp, and I'll show you one in the next slide. It comes along, stings it, lays an egg inside of it. That egg hatches, matures. The larvae eats the inside of that scale, and then that scale, of course, dies. So you want to look for parasitized scale. That is important. But when you monitor, you want to monitor for just live scale, or count just live scale, rather. So in February, a moderate population is from, let me go back. I'm sure you can read this, but 1-year-old fruiting wood, look at live scale and parasitized scale. And so examine several pieces of this 1-year-old wood, about 12 inches long, throughout the orchard in several places. And then count that. And a moderate population is from 1 to 5 live scale per inch. Heavy population is greater than 10 per inch. How you treat it now, that's between you and your PCA or you PCAs and your grower. Most of the time, that pest is well kept under control via biological control agents. And that's Metaphicus ludiosus. That's the parasitoid that I've spoke about. That's very, very small. You don't see them. That's the one that stings the black scale. And then there's a Rhizobius species. That's a beetle that eats the immature stage. You can see one just up to the right-hand side of the back right-hand side of the beetle there. If you use a chemical there's chemical options as well, narrow range oil. You want to do that in February. You want to be careful. Don't go too early on that. IGRs, insect growth regulators. If you at all possible, avoid the pyrethroids. Avoid the pyrethroids because you'll blow these natural enemies right out of the water. Next one. As I said, I got kind of a laundry list here. It's hopefully keep you interested in this. And again, these information are available on the UCIPM website. So we have cotton aphid. Really, really interesting pest here. Numerous hosts. I think the number is around 700. So they form on the underside of leaves. They are about 1/16 of an inch long, and don't let the color fool you. They're reddish green to greenish black, and they form on the underside of leaves in colonies, and they're winged and wingless forms. You'll see there. So interesting about this aphid species is that it does not diminish in hot weather. And as I said before, and I'll say a couple more times, I think, this species produces honeydew. So it's not only sucking on a plant sap, but it produces honeydew, which is a medium for black sooty mold, which reduces photosynthesis. Large populations can reduce shoot growth, and for young trees, that's obviously not a good thing. So you want to monitor in spring, examine newly budded trees. And interesting, there's no threshold. Thresholds for most species and most crops, scientifically based thresholds, don't exist. They're called nominal thresholds. We use them and they work, but they come from folks like you out there in the field who understand these pests, have seen these many times. So the treatment for these for cotton aphid really is between you and your pest control advisor or that group of people that are managing that orchard and your experience. However, biological control agents typically do very, very well. Convergent lady beetle, Aphelinus species, that's again another parasitoid. You can see that there on the right-hand side that's stinging. The aphid, green lacewing, and syrphid flies. Cultural controls. So what are these? These are going right down the list of principles of integrated pest management. So control those weeds. I think milkweed is an important one. You want to avoid an excess of nitrogen. And I think in today's environment, we have got that pretty much under control, but avoid too much nitrogen. So the chemical control agents out there, of course, neonics, those are the systemic ones. There's pyrethroids, you want to stay away from that. Spinetoram and narrow range oil are very, very effective against this pest. False chinch bug, very, very interesting, really interesting. And this has wreaked havoc on a lot of new orchards, and a lot of PCAs have said, wow, I have had problems with this bug. This kind of looks like a lygus bug. big-eyed bug as well. Don't confuse those. So this is small. It's light brown, about 1/8 of an inch long. And so don't get it confused. The damage that it does is pretty darn severe. In the spring, they can feed on the young trees and they cause wilt, and it can actually cause the plant to die. They have not only they're sucking juices out of the plant, that's what they're feeding on, but they inject a toxicant. Well, I think it's their saliva, which is toxic to the plant. Even feeding on older trees can result in severe leaf drop. So what do we do about these? There's some cultural control, and so that's mowing the ground cover before bloom. That's before the pistachio trees bloom. That's one way of doing it. And chemical control is primarily broad spectrum insecticides are your best bet, or maybe your only bet there. So you want to make sure you can apply them early in the morning, early in the evening or morning. And they're most effective if the trunk guards are removed, because those nymphs can hide in there. The way false chink bug moves in is that it's from the surrounding areas, typically, or on the weeds in the cover crop. And then once that dries down and that food source is no longer suitable for them, then they move as nymphs en masse to green vegetation. And there's some adults in there, but it's typically the immatures that move. Darkling beetles. Not, in my experience, I haven't had a lot of calls on this, but it's well worth mentioning. It's about an eighth of an inch to 1/2 an inch long, and they're black to bluish black. The larvae inhabit the soil. They're kind of tough to see, and certainly the eggs, you can see the eggs up there on the right-hand picture on the top. The damage they do is by the adults feed. So about 3 to 4 week old Kerman buds are in danger of being fed upon. Now, the bottom beetle there is a predator beetle, and you don't want to confuse those two, where that number 4 up there on that top picture is the darkling beetle, and on the bottom, that's a predator beetle. So don't get that confused, because that's a good guy. So this beetle can also feed on Kerman shoots following the first dormant period. Management, cultural control, avoid disking weeds in and outside of the orchard at the time of blooming. It will cause those insects to move from what they were feeding on those weeds to the newly budded trees. So chemicals, broad spectrum insecticides. Again, I have here carbamate. I'm pretty sure, again, make sure you read the label or read the UCIPM website and make sure that that's correct. No threshold. So that's between you and your PCA or your pest management person. Okay, so that comes with experience. If you've seen a bunch of buds that are fed upon, then you've got an issue. Something that's not in the UCIPM website is ants. And the reason I have ants here is because they are very important in maximizing the beneficial insects out there, especially with things like soft scale. You want to make sure that the ants are not present. I frankly have not seen a lot of ants in pistachios like I see in almonds, but they are out there. So the direct damage, they can feed on emerging buds post grafting. They can girdle some buds. So Indirect damage. This is when I really started out mentioning. They tend honeydew producing hemipterans. And so they disrupt those natural enemies. If you're going to make the best of those natural enemies, you've got to make sure that the ants are in a minimal presence. There's lots of ant species out there, but we don't have a lot of great baits for all of the ant species. So these top two, in southern fire ant and pavement ant, we've got some excellent baits. And the southern ant is on the thief ant to a lesser degree. The baits are a little bit effective against. I haven't seen a lot of activity against that ant, but it's better than nothing. So those two top ones are the lipid feeding ants, and the baits are extremely effective against. Ants that you might see in the orchard, in a new orchard out there, is a pyramid ant and the native gray ant. Those are very, very, very common ants, especially in almonds, but they tend honeydew. They will collect honeydew and disrupt natural enemies. Unfortunately, we don't have any great baits that are effective against these species yet. We're looking at it, and we think hopefully, you know, sugar coating some of the granular baits with powdered sugar might help, but we haven't had great luck with that yet. So just about the granular baits, there's insect growth regulators, that's pyriproxyfen and methoprene. We have stomach poisons, which is the abamectin, and I failed to put ultraven, and that's metaflumazone. So those granular baits are extremely effective. There's a picture of an ATV there, and that's the way that you would control that pest. I don't know how I'm doing on time. So hopefully I'm doing okay. This pest I put on here because I want to tell you that I have seen interplantings with pomegranate in pistachio. And as I understand it, I would not recommend that. Pistachio is pomegranate rather, is very, very important in the life cycle of leaf-footed bug. They do direct damage as the tree, especially when the trees are mature. It causes nut drop. Late season feeding results in kernel necrosis, and right there on the top picture. Indirect damage. There is some indirect damage, and that's associated with Botrosphaeria, and they do transmit that to the bunches, and that causes panicle and shoot blight. So I don't recommend planting like this picture on the right-hand side. That is between, that big pomegranate tree is between pistachio. So you want to avoid that. Pomegranates are great hedgerows, but if, you know, at this point, I just can't recommend it because they do attract leaf-footed bug, and that causes damage, both almonds and pistachios. Pyrethroids are your only class of insecticides that are effective against leaf-footed bug. Okay, last but not least here, we've got web-spinning mites. What's interesting about web-spinning mites on pistachio is that they're so sensitive. I think you all know what a web-spinning mite looks like. They're very small. The nymphs, hey, they have 6 legs, but these are arthropods. They're arachnids. They're more related to spiders. They're not arachnids, but they're more related to spiders. So they overwinter as reddish orange females, right there in the top picture. The damage appears as small dead spots, or that's called stippling. And here it is, 3 to 4 mites per leaf are sufficient to cause defoliation. I believe in older trees, it's not quite that, but in younger trees, it's 3 to 4 mites. That is extremely low. Almond trees can take much, much, much more energy than that. So this is something you want to watch for. You want to minimize the dust Make sure your trees are well irrigated. That says well watered. That should say read irrigated. You want to avoid pyrethroids because that blows out these natural enemies like 6-spotted thrips, spider mite destroyer. So, and chemical controls. There's several really, really effective acaricides available for mite management. But these two here, especially that 6-spotted thrips, should just blow these spider mites right out of the water. So you don't want to do anything that takes those out. And with that, I will take any questions if I have time. And Jalendra, are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think we have plenty of time. So about 5-7 minutes. So any.
Well, before we do that, let me just launch the DPR poll question first.
Pardon me, Kelly. Yeah.
No worries. I'm going to launch it right now. So for those in the audience that want DPR credit, make sure that you should see a poll right now. It has 3 questions. So make sure you scroll through and take those questions. Make sure you do all 3 and then press the submit button. We'll give you about a minute here to do it. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Chris, if you could just go over them briefly, read the question and then go over the answers.
Okay, soft scale on young pistachio trees are typically kept under economically damaging levels by, well, applying broad spectrum insecticides could do it, but typically biological control agents such as parasitoids and rhizobius beetles are the ones that do it. If you don't have any of those biological control agents out there, because you're applying broad spectrum insecticides, then you'd have to apply broad spectrum insecticides. It's kind of circular there. So due to the possibility of causing damaging infestations of leaf-footed bug to new as well as mature pistachio, it is not recommended to interplant a new pistachio orchard with pomegranate is correct. Tomatoes probably can be a problem. You know, interestingly, since I do have a little bit of time, I went faster than I thought I would go. Tomatoes is one of the main hosts of leaf-footed bug. Now, it's not a perennial crop, but it is one of the main hosts.
Hey, Chris.
So anyways,
Chris,
just pomegranate.
Just want to mention that.
Pardon me?
Hey, Chris, just want to mention that there are a lot of questions on Q&A. So if you can probably go there and do those answer, or if you want me to read those questions, I think that would be.
Yeah, why don't you read them? Is there, okay, I didn't see that there were 3. I'm sorry, I got distracted. If tending hemipteran pests in a new orchard, southern fire ant can most be effectively controlled by baits. Protein feeding baits is the correct answer. All right, Jalendra, you want to ask the questions?
Sure.
Read them.
So why avoiding excess nitrogen application for controlling cotton aphid?
Well, it makes a lot of new flush, and that flush is very tender and allows those aphids to do very well. And nitrogen is an important component of their nutritional needs. So they're sucking out those plant juices trying to get nitrogen is one of the components that they need for growth, of course. And so you don't want to overdo it and kind of give them what they really want in excess.
Thanks, Chris. The second one is regarding the false chinch bug. Do you recommend spreading 7 bait in early spring as a precautionary method?
I don't have experience with that. And so I wouldn't be able to recommend that. And I at this point don't know if that is a registered method to control that pest. So soil applications, I'm not familiar with. No. So no.
Okay. Next one I have here is, are there ways to encourage parasitic wasp, lady beetles, or other beneficial?
There are ways. Cover crops can do it. Now, cover crops need to be managed. If you have cover crops that they can feed on, the adults a lot of times can feed on nectar. There are some pests in there that maybe the parasitoid could survive on. So yeah, there are lots of ways to encourage them, but more so, you want to not discourage them by broad spectrum insecticides that just, blow them out of the water. And pyrethroids are one of the main culprits out there that do that. So trying to avoid those broad spectrum is the best bet. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. I think we still have a lot of questions there unanswered. So if you don't mind to go to the chat box and hopefully type your answer. And hopefully we'll have time later also to catch up with some of these. So thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for
You know what?
Uh-huh.
Why don't you take a couple more? We're waiting for one of our speakers to join. Why don't you take a couple more live while I try and get a hold of them?
Okay, sounds good. Any
Awesome.
live questions?
Woohoo.
Or just keep reading them from the Q&A list.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's so the next question is, does neem oil have any effectiveness against this arthropod pest?
I'm sorry, Jalendra, could you read that one more time again?
I said the neem oil, is it effective against these arthropod pests?
Did they mention a specific pest?
No, it's a various arthropod pest.
Various. Neem oil really acts as an insect growth regulator. So it is effective against juveniles. And if you're targeting a juvenile stage, neem oil can be effective. You've got to get great coverage. And so I don't have a lot of experience applying neem oil against this suite of insects that I've talked about. But there are a lot of folks out there that just have very, very good results with neem oil against immatures.
And perhaps it depends on the different species of the insect or the arthropod pest you're talking about.
Exactly. Thank you, Jalendra. Yes.
Okay. So next one is, Kelly, you can interrupt anytime if we are when we're ready. Okay. The next question I'm going to present here is, what about non-web spinning mites? I have heard of applying sulfur to pistachio to control mites. So do you think that sulfur would do the job for mite control?
Citrus flat mite is more so a problem on older pistachio trees, or pistachio trees that are producing. They feed in the bunches on the rachis and degrade it, and then kill the fruit, and then those bunches that are affected by the citrus flat mite don't fall off, and that's navel orange worm fodder, so you don't want that. Sulfur is effective against citrus flat mite, very, very much so. Some good from Bob Beatty to me Oh, I'm sorry, I got distracted. So it's good, very effective against citrus flat mite, but not so much the other mites. I would not recommend sulfur against the other mites, no.
Okay. So next one is, what insect need active management via chemicals for pistachio farming in Madeira?
Jalendra, there's a little bit of activity happening here, and I got distracted.
Sure.
My kids are waking up to go to school, and I thought I would get in before them, but
Sure. I'll
okay.
repeat it.
Could you read that again, please?
So it says, what insect need active management via chemicals for pistachio farming in Madeira? So essentially, what insect that you control using chemicals in pistachio? So
well, if there's no natural enemies, yeah,
yep.
There's most of them, right?
So yeah,
but
every insect has there is the option for the chemical control, but we want to use it if there is need, right?
Right. So we want to try and avoid, especially with those young trees, because there are so many natural enemies out there, and typically things are pretty stable. Once we start, the battle against the navel orangeworm, and we're doing our sanitation and we still likely have to spray at least one spray, maybe two, in pistachios. Then things get a little dicier with with the natural enemies. So yeah, the whole host of them, there are effective compounds against. But specifically, I don't have an answer to that with specific pests and specific insecticide.
Okay. Next one is, any recommendation for citrus flat mite management regarding timing and which material have shown to be effectiveness besides sulfur? Timing and which material except sulfur?
I don't have a good answer for that. Bob Beatty is on, and he has lots of experience. The timing, I would imagine that it's best in May, April, May, when
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the call.
there.
Yeah, so I think, Chris, if you're not sure about some of the answer, you can postpone that and then type.
Yeah, I'm going to postpone that, and I'll have to get back to that.
Yeah,
And it looks like we can. Thank you so much, Chris.
You're welcome.
We are going to get started with our next speaker pretty here as soon as he's set up. So thank you. Chris, if you could stick around and answer any other Q&A by typing the answer,
okay,
that would be great. You just open the Q&A box and press type answer, and you can type answers directly into the Q&A box.
Okay, very good. Thank you for having me. Thank you for thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Jalendra.
Okay, so looks like David, are you ready? You're muted.
There you go. I'm unmuted. I just need to pull up my presentation here.
Sounds good. Okay, so well, in the meantime, I'll introduce you.
Perfect. Thank you.
So the next speaker is David Haviland. He's Cooperative Extension Entomology Advisor in Kern County. And the topic he's going to cover is mealybugs and scale insect in pistachio. David?
Yeah, let me get set up here. I'm almost there.
Sure. If you have any, the participant, if you have any additional questions, you can please keep those in the Q&A sections, and we may not be able to answer all of them, after each session because of the time, but speaker will stick around and hopefully answer all of them, those questions, and some cases we hopefully will get back to you. So with that, David, looks like you're ready. I can see your PowerPoint. You can just need to do the slideshow.
Yeah. All right, am I good?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, sorry about the delay there. I've got 4 different talks today, and I got my wires crossed on what's going on this morning, at a few different conferences. So the talk today, or this discussion, is about mealybug and scale insects. And the scales I'll go through really, really quickly, just because that's a minor issue. But mealybugs are a significant issue. It used to be just in a couple orchards here and there, but it's getting to the point that it's pretty much everywhere and something you have to deal with every year. So again, just to start off on the scales, I'll go through this really, really quickly. We've got 3 different species that attack the pistachios. There's a black scale, European fruit licanium, and the frosted scale. All 3 of these are quite similar. They all have 1 to 5 generations per year. They all suck on some plant juices, and they can reduce yields, but the biggest issue is that they produce honeydew. And when you got all that honeydew on top of the plant, and you can have some issues with decreased photosynthesis. But before I move on here, I want to just show you this really quickly. If you look at these down here, Jalindra, can you confirm that you can see the laser pointer for me?
You can see it, yes.
Perfect, thank you. I just want to point this out here because this is really common with scale. Do you see this? There's all these little holes in the surface. Okay, all those little holes in the surface indicate that a parasitoid came out. So scale, generally speaking, in pistachio orchards is controlled very well by biological control. So here's some more pictures now. You can see the close-up there of the exit holes right here. And the other thing that will eat the scale is Phytochorus. So this is a small bug here. Now Phytochorus can also feed on the young pistachios early in the season and ding them and cause them to drop. But this guy right here has a large straw-like mouth part. It'll stick it in the scale and feed on them. So again, scale is something you're going to find. If you take the scale, you kind of pop it off. The whole insect will come off the insect. If you're going to monitor, go out about January, and if you see maybe 10 scale per inch, that's what our guidelines say, then that's considered a heavy infestation and something you should do about, something you should do something to. But the reality is that in most cases, when you start looking at these scales, you'll see that they're pretty heavily parasitized and nothing needs to be done about it. If you do need to treat, oil works, pyriproxyfen will do well. Buprofuscin, those are both growth regulators, but also 7, carbaryl. All those can be effective in mid-February. So pretty easy to control, but generally not something you need to control. Now, Gill's mealybugs. So this is the one we really care about. And Gill's mealybug got into Tulare County about 1990s and slowly started spreading through the state. So by 2004, it was in about 2,000 acres, at least 5,000, or at least 5 counties. By 2007, it got up into the 6,000 acres range. And then 2020, it's pretty much all over the state, at least in all the growing regions. It's certainly not in every orchard, but it's in at least one orchard, if not most of them, in most regions. Now, identification, I'll go through quickly just because it's the only mealybug that really gets to be heavy numbers in the pistachios. But you can see here's the adults. They have all these glassy, fibrous, almost looks like cotton candy or fiberglass on the surface of them. You can see this right here. Same thing. So if you see that, it's mealybugs. Now, a few other pictures here, or a few other key things. First of all, this mealybug has live birth. In case there's no egg sac, it just pops the little baby nymphs out one at a time from the underside of the body. And males and females wise, the females looks like a traditional mealybug. You can see the adults here. You can see some crawlers down here, these little yellow guys. These are the brand new nymphs. Immature. So here you can see a larger immature, smaller immature, and this is what the male looks like. You probably won't ever see a male unless you're really, really looking for them, just because they fly around and look like little wasps. Now, there is one look-alike that sometimes you'll see in pistachios. I'm just going to quickly point it out to make sure you don't spray for it. It's called the great mealybug. And first thing to do, Gill's mealybug has these 2 fat tails. Great mealybug has these 4 long tails. Okay, Gill's mealybug has the glassy rods. The grape does not. There's no egg sac on the Gill's mealybug. You can see all the babies here, whereas the great mealybug has an egg sac right here. And then if you poke the great mealybug, you'll get these little red droplets that come out of what's called an ostiole. And if you see that come out as great mealybug, Gill's mealybug will not do that. Why do I point these out? I point this out because Gill's mealybug is your pest, needs to be controlled. Great mealybug is a also ran. Sometimes you'll see it, but it's extremely rare. And if it is there, it has never in the history of the universe caused economic damage of pistachios. So if you see it, just let it go. It'll just kind of go away on its own. Now, I want to walk through the year what you're going to see. So this is during the winter. Right now, if you go to a pistachio orchard and look for Gill's mealybug, here's what you'll see. And these are all mealybugs that were adults around September. And what they'll do is after harvest, they'll all move to the trunk and knot holes and anywhere they can tuck themselves in. They'll make a whole bunch of crawlers and they'll die. And those crawlers will go and hide and find the places to spend the winter. So on one hand, it's true to say that what you're looking at is mealybugs. At the same time, what you're really looking at is a bunch of dead mealybugs from last year. Anything that's alive, you're not seeing right now because it's the teeny little crawler stage that's tucked away in the cracks and crevices where you can't see them. Now, those little babies about March, they'll wake up and they feed on the phloem, and they can tell when the phloem in the tree starts pushing nutrients up to the buds. And so they'll move at that time and they'll go and feed right here at the base of the bud, right as they start to push. Once you get into late March and April, you'll see them, basically at that same spot. They'll start developing and get a little bigger, right about the base of where a cluster forms. Late April, they're now getting to be larger. Got an adult female on the right and a smaller female on the left. And then between mid-May to early June, those crawlers that are hiding out right now in the winter will become adults that you can see right here. And these adults will start making all these babies. And in this picture, you have an adult with babies underneath her. And there's actually another adult right here in this little sort of nest you can see. And I just popped her off and removed her. These are what was underneath her. So again, mid-April to early June is when you're going to see this. This is a picture you should memorize in your head because this is your treatment timing. Okay, this is when you're going to take care of the mealybugs. Now, let me go back. So now focus on the little crawlers right here. Okay, so these crawlers that are born at the end of May and early June are going to look like this by the time you get to late June and early July. And then by the time you get to mid-July, they're going to make crawlers. So massive, massive numbers in crawlers. Of course, these mealybugs are all feeding on really nutritious hulls. They got lots of nutrients. They make lots and lots and lots of babies. You can see all the way around here. Now, those mid-July to early August crawlers, they're the ones that are going to be adults at harvest, making a mess. So here they are, sort of mid-size in their life. Here it is once you get to August and September, you'll start seeing clusters that look like this, completely engulfed in honeydew, sooty mold, mealybugs, wax, excrement. And then they'll actually make so much honeydew that it'll drip off of the clusters, and you can see these wet spots on the bark right here below where the clusters are. So here's just a close-up at harvest of how things can look. It's not pretty. Now, those adults that are around right around harvest, they will start making crawlers, those overwintering ones that I showed you in that first slide. And they'll make millions and millions of them right at the time that you're dragging through your harvest equipment, that you're shaking the trees. And you can imagine you got millions of crawlers, you got honeydew, things are sticky, you're dragging equipment through the trees, you're shaking the trees, you're running blowers to spew the leaves off the side of these harvesters. And basically you're spreading mealybug crawlers everywhere within the orchard. And then crawlers that get on this equipment gets hauled on bins, gets hauled on harvest equipment from orchard to orchard. That is the main way that it spreads. Here's a picture of what, this was actually from one of our research trials. The nuts on the left came from a tree that was sprayed in late May, or early, in this case, June 1st, but it was actually a few days before that. And then the tree on the right was an untreated check that wasn't sprayed. But a couple things I want to point out. First of all, this nut right here looks nasty and ugly. This looks pretty ugly, but this nut's perfectly fine. This is just some honeydew and sooty mold on the surface of the hull. Same thing right here. These nuts perfectly normal. These obviously, when you get these stick tights and shriveled kernels, that's an economic problem. But I want to point out that this picture, this is from horrendous mealybug populations that were untreated in this trial. We can, but you should never see anything that looks like this because of the modern day treatments. Now, what exactly is the damage? The biggest damage that occurs is actually that the mealybugs are intercepting carbohydrates that were intended for kernel development. And in the case of pistachios, the shell splitting is because the kernel grows and mechanically pushes it open. So if you have smaller kernels, you're going to have less shells that split open. So really where the damage is caused is that you get a lower percentage of split in shell nuts. And anytime a split in shell nut doesn't split and is still closed, you lose about half the value on that nut, just because of the way the pricing goes in pistachios. No one wants to eat a closed shell, right? So that's really the concern. And one of the reasons I point that out is you're not going to see that in your huller sheet. If you get your huller sheet back and it says you got paid, by weight, 70% split in shell, you're gonna be like, okay, that's great. But if there's a lot of mealybug damage in there, the reality is maybe it would have been 75% or more split in shell, but it got reduced to 70 because of the mealybugs. So again, this isn't like navel orange or something else where you can look at your huller sheet and say, look, there's my worm damage, or here's my stink bug damage. It's kind of obscured. So what are we going to do about it? So here's the generations. As I mentioned, we've got this I'll start here. Overwintering generation. You got this massive number of crawlers. Okay, massive number of new mealybugs that starts right here in the clusters at harvest as it ends. And the actual numbers would be up off the chart, but the measurement here was mealybugs per cluster. And a lot of the mealybugs have already moved off the cluster at this point. But you get those crawlers, they'll overwinter here all the way through. Right here is that late May to 1st of June period of time where you're going to have crawlers emerge. We're going to have the crawlers emerge again right here at the beginning of the second generation, and then crawlers emerge right here at harvest. So where do you look for mealybugs? Simple chart here. This shows from March to September and shows the percentage of mealybugs at different locations. So you can see all the way through April, they're all on the butter wood. In May, right here, when we want to monitor, they're either on the butter wood or they're on the rachis. And the reality is they're at the interface of the two through this period of time. So you don't have to search through the whole tree in May. You just have to look right at the base of the rachis, right where that interface is between old and new wood. That's where they're going to be. Okay. After June, all of them are on the hull. So that's where you're going to look for them, right here, regardless of the date. Okay, so the treatment timings, as I kind of already mentioned, the main one is right here at the first, just before the 1st of June, when these crawlers emerge. If you need more than one timing, the next best timing tends to be right here in the middle of July, when the crawlers emerge in the 2nd generation. And then post-harvest and spring treatments are currently under evaluation. People have had interest in that more recently. Now, we've done work on treatment thresholds. I'm not going to go through this chart in detail, but I just want to show you, here's the number of mealybugs in May per cluster. Here's the percentage grower paid weight. You can see there's a really nice line right here when we look at all these data. And I'm not going to go through this, but just leave this in your slides if you want to go back and reference it. This is how we calculated economic injury levels. And when you take those levels, you can calculate them different ways. And again, you can go back and do your own math on this. But what does it cost to control goes into the calculations. And that can be anywhere from $40 up to, let's say, $80 for something like Movento, a high rate. Well, it also matters what your yield's going to be. If you're expecting 1,500 pounds because you're in a definite off year versus, let's say, 4,000 pounds on a mostly on year, that's going to affect the calculations. Price matters in the calculation. So, sometimes you might get $2 a pound. Some years you might be getting $4 a pound. This is a number that we calculated. But the take-home message here in economic injury levels, on average, if you've got 1 mealybug per 10 clusters in May, you need to do something about it economically, okay? Economic injury level. Now, I want to point out how much that can change, though. If you're only going to get 1,500 pounds anticipated yield that year, and it's going to cost you $80 to treat, you don't really need to treat unless you've got 1 mealybug per 4 clusters, just because your returns are not going to be as good. To the opposite end of the spectrum, if it only costs you $40 to spray, you're expecting 4,000 or more pounds, and you're going to get you expect to get $4 a pound that year. Prices are looking really, really good. You should be spraying if you can find 1 mealybug in 40 clusters. So almost like if you can find it, treat it. Okay, so each year you're going to have to make some decisions on when to treat. I don't want to pretend that every orchard that has the mealybug should be treated. That's certainly not the case. But you can see here, it's anywhere from pretty good tolerance to absolutely have to spray with an average of 1 per 10. This is adult females in May. So what can you treat with? So Centaur has been the product that's sort of been of choice for more than a decade. It's timed at 1st generation crawlers. It's a very good crawler product. The issue with Centaur that really needs to be pointed out is there are some MRL issues for exported nuts. So before you use Centaur, please call your huller and ask them where your nuts are going to be sent. It might be that the huller says it's going to be to some of those areas that have MRL issues. Please do not use this product. And other cases, they're going to say, oh, yep, we're clear. Your nuts aren't going to go to those places. Go for it and use it. The second product that's become quite standard is Movento. Also generally timed to that 1st generation, maybe sprayed a little bit earlier just because it is a systemic product, takes a little bit of time to get in the plant. You do have to have a good surfactant with that product. And I do want to point out that we've done several trials that have showed that a 6-ounce rate is just as good as a 9-ounce rate. I say here in the 2015 study, but we actually have others that support that same conclusion. The difference between 6 and 9 ounces is probably $25 an acre. So, if you've got a super big mess you're really trying to clean up, certainly go 9. But, in most cases, just standard populations, 6 is going to do you just as well and can save you $25 an acre. Next product is a sale. This product's good at that May timing, but also is the best of all of the products if you have to hit the 2nd generation. So that's this bullet point right here. That's in mid-July. That timing's never as good as the late May timing, but if you do need to use it, a sale tends to be the best product. Now, two other products that have been registered fairly recently, Sequoia and Belay. Both of those, I'm going to say they're options. We've had excellent control from both of them in some trials. We've also had trials that they haven't worked as well as they should have, and we're not sure why. So I'm just going to say here, they are an option. The results have been a little bit inconsistent, but certainly something to rotate in the system because you just can't keep doing Movento and Centaur and Assail every single year. And I'll show you a little bit about that in a minute why. And then lastly, there's Admire. Admire tends to be not as effective. It's only about a 50% reduction in damage product. At the same time, it's under $10 an acre, and it's essentially free to apply through a drip system. So, if you just need a product that takes the edge off the mealybugs for cheap and helps out, absolutely, Admire is a possibility for you. Now, here's just a couple trials. Just want to show you some patterns. You can see the low damage, Assail, Centaur, Movento, all looking good. In this case, Sequoia also did well. Here's another trial, same thing. You can see Movento and Centaur and Assail all doing really well. In this case, Belay did really well. Closer did okay. Here's just another one, 6 and 9 ounces Movento, Centaur and Assail looking the best. Belay and Sequoia on a sort of next tier. They did something certainly compared to the untreated check, but they weren't down in the range of the three main products that are used. Now, lastly, I want to jump to 2019 because we've been having some issues that these products just have not been working like they're supposed to. This is not just one grower. This is multiple products, multiple growers that previously these products have worked really well. And you can see the pattern still holds. Movento, Assail, and Centaur still, much better than the untreated check. Sequoia also did okay here. But here's my concern. This is the average mealybugs per cluster right here. This is the 13th of August, and we're over 100. Okay. It is absolutely unacceptable with one application of any product to still be at 100 mealybugs per cluster on average in August with a month to go before harvest. So this right here was very disappointing. By the way, the grower got the same results with their, they actually went 9 ounces of Movento. They got the exact same results. We're hearing this kind of control from lots of people in lots of places. So not exactly sure what's going on, but it's kind of been 2 years in a row that there's been poor control with these products. We have to suspect there's some resistance going on from overuse of the same product year after year. So here again, summary, 2019 and 20, you've got control failures, lots of counties, so on. And these, by the way, are growers that use the same timings, rates, products, surfactants, and everything else very successfully in previous years in the same orchards. So what that's leading us to do is to think about what else can we do to combat this. First of all, timing. So let's make sure that that May treatment that goes on absolutely is timed at crawler emergence. So that means monitoring very closely in May of those adult females and spray right when those crawlers are coming out. Don't miss that timing, okay? Make sure the timing is done with good coverage. And then I put here conserve biocontrol. Biocontrol, I don't recall. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna talk about that in just a minute. And then develop a backup plan. So what I mean by that is after your treatment goes on in the middle to late June or middle to late May, monitor, make sure you determine if a second treatment is going to be needed. And if it is, put it on in the last 2 weeks of July when you got crawlers emerging again. And then lastly, get a jump on next year. There's experiments being done with post-harvest treatments and early spring treatments. I'm not going to talk much about those just because we haven't really gotten a lot of data at this point to show how effective those are. Now, a couple of comments on biocontrol. The main biocontrol you have helping you out there is actually lacewings. You can see the lacewing larva right here eating a mealybug nymph. They do okay. There's also parasitoids. These parasitoids are very common on Gill's mealybug in almonds and in rare occasions when they're found in grapes. We've never seen these parasitoids in pistachios. And we can't really explain why, other than to say that pistachio growers typically use a lot of pyrethroids. Even organic growers use permethrin products. So there's potential for biocontrol. You can see these mealybugs here completely parasitized. Exit hole, exit hole, exit hole, exit hole, exit hole. This is a picture. You can see how these are just all hammered by parasitoids on the bark of an almond tree. So again, we have to think that pyrethroid use in pistachios and permethrins are part of the reason, but there's pretty good potential for parasitoids. And certainly we want to keep the lacewing larvae doing what they do. The other predator that's out there, and these pictures are actually from pistachios, is there's a beetle. It's actually a ladybug, a small brown ladybug right here. Maybe a third of the size of a ladybug you might be familiar with that you'd see on a, just standard old ladybug. This is the ladybug adult. Here's the mealybugs. These right here are larvae of the beetle. Okay, these are not mealybugs. This right here, likewise, is not a mealybug. This is the larva of the beetle eating a mealybug. Okay, these larvae, here's the pupal cases of them. In this case, the pupae have emerged into adults already. So if you see this beetle, in fact, most common time to see it is this time of year. If you look kind of the base of the tree or around where you see those mealybugs, you can find these beetles and you can find these larvae out there. So preserving them is going to be great. So last slide here, just to summarize, you're going to monitor in May, treat when the crawlers emerge in late May to early June, treat if you have one mealybug per about 10 clusters, just on average. Centaur, Movento, Assail, your main options. Sequoia and Belay also options. You can put an additional treatment on in late June if needed. Not ideal, but it's the best second option. We're investigating post-harvest and bud break treatments, and then make sure you're not moving mealybugs from site to site, especially if you have young orchards that don't have it. Make sure any harvest equipment that gets to those young orchards is cleaned before it comes to your orchard, not after. And pruning crews, if you don't think you have mealybugs, pruning crews are a great way to report mealybugs. Offer them a 6-pack if they find it, that kind of thing, whatever it takes. And then anything you do to preserve natural enemies is going to help you out. So with that, thank you very much for listening. Sorry about the delay and at the beginning on getting on board here, but there are a fair number of resources on mealybugs. I'll talk more about some of these in another presentation later today, but I believe this is in your handouts that you received for the conference, this particular publication right here, as well as all the online resources that I'll talk about for all pests later today. So with that, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Okay, well, thank you, David. I think we'll have a poll question next, Kelly.
Yes, I've gone ahead and launched the poll. There are 3 questions, so make sure you scroll through and answer them. And go ahead and submit that. We'll give you about a minute and a half. And then David, if you could stick around, there are a few questions. We'll take those after we go through the poll answers, once everyone has about a minute and a half to fill it out.
Great, sounds good.
Okay, I'm going to end the polling and I'm going to share the results. So David, if you could just go through, read the question, and then go over the answers.
Great. So yeah, answers. So everyone can see the results, right?
Yes.
Correct. It's being shared with everyone.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I don't think I need to go over the answers here because I think it was pretty obvious. But yeah, best time to treat late May, period. No doubt. Susceptible stage, crawler. And by the way, crawler stage, that's the most susceptible for pretty much any scale or mealybug, not just Gill's mealybug. And then how many generations per year? Okay, so we got a little less performance on this question. So the answer is 3. Okay, half you got it right. So those of you that put 2 or 4, so let me just reiterate. So there's the generation from late May through July. Okay, you're going to treat those crawlers. There's the generation from mid-July through harvest. That's the second generation. And then there's the generation that starts at harvest. That's the overwintering generation. So If you were thinking in your head that there's 2 in-season generations and you put 2, that'd be correct. And you didn't, and you forgot to count the overwintering generation. So good, overall good results. So answering the questions. So the first one here is basically saying, what about bud break treatments? Is that a good timing? And the answer is, I don't know. So, and it depends on your perspective. So we did one trial a few years ago where we compared bud break treatments to June 1st-ish treatments or late May treatments. And what we showed is that the bud break treatments, so those were done with the idea of you only want to treat once a year. So in that comparison, we showed that bud break treatment does something as a solo treatment, but it's not nearly as effective as the late May timing. So, and that if you sprayed at bud break, it didn't prevent the need of spraying in late May. So if you want to spray once, do it in late May. Do not do it at bud break because you'll have to spray twice. Now, if I change that context and say, what if you want to spray twice? Okay, what that same trial showed is that bud break treatment does something, it can help, but not as much as May. So I have to assume that a bud break plus May is going to be better than a May alone. But again, if you're going to do one treatment, May is better than bud break. So just have to, put those into context. The question is in association with mealybugs and disease. So those clusters that you see, those clusters in my picture that just look nasty, nasty, nasty with all the honeydew and all that, and all the feedings and stuff, no disease. So no association with aflatoxin, no association with any disease whatsoever, no matter how bad the mealybug looks. The only mold you're going to get is that what grows on top of is the sooty mold, but that doesn't cause any problems. Any problems. What does more economic damage, mealybug or navel orangeworm? Navel orangeworm wins that 1,000-fold. Okay, so navel orangeworm is absolutely gets in the nut, and you're going to see major problems with your crack out sheet, and you're going to see aflatoxin issues. The mealybugs, what you're going to see in extreme cases is a reduction of split end shells, a little bit lower on the yields, and then maybe a little bit of dark staining on your second shake if it's really, really bad. But it's, again, the economics it's relatively minor, very relatively minor in context if you're comparing it to navel orangeworm. How often is mid-July second spray? Oops, things just scrolled. Okay, the question is, how often is mid-July second spray required for mealybugs? And I'm just going to say I don't know on that. It used to be that it was never required whatsoever. And now it's getting to the point that it's becoming common for some growers. It just depends on how much resistance they have, how much mealybugs is there to start with. But percentage-wise, I can't say how many are doing it, but unfortunately, it's becoming more and more common. Let's see, for David, if spraying twice. Yes, so if the question is about rotating products, essentially, if you're going to spray twice, yeah, my recommendation, I think the ideal would be either a Centaur or a Movento on the first spray, and then a Sail on the second. That way you're rotating. But there's certainly lots of other combinations you could do. Plus for resistance management reasons, there is Belay that also helps with bugs. There is Sequoia also that also helps with bugs. So maybe you choose those products as a second mealybug product that also give you some stink bug and leaf-footed bug and small bugs control in the process. So lots of combinations. Talk to your pest control advisor about that. Tractor speeds question. Tractor speeds are typically 2 miles an hour is pretty standard. I don't see any reason to go slower than that. Any faster than that, you're going to be compromising coverage. And then it looks like we're getting to, let's see, a thank you, Chris comment. Let's see. Okay, and the last question I see for myself, is regarding, are there any specific Kerman pesticides? Let's see, is there any specific pesticide for Kerman type pistachio, or is it for all types? All of my recommendations are for all types. The timing of the mealybugs is going to be the same. The only difference that I see is that in your non-current, let's say your Golden Hills or other earlier varieties, you're going to be harvesting those while you still have adult females in the cluster, but before those females are making lots of crawlers. Whereas with your Kerman's first and second shake, you're going to be getting those overwintered crawlers emerging while you're doing your first shake, and absolutely emerge during the second shake. So yeah, maybe with an early, a Golden Hills early variety, you might see a little less staining or a teeny bit less damage just because you're getting the nuts off the trees earlier. But the guidelines for management remain unchanged.
I
Okay.
think that's it. It's time for a break. We would be back at 9:30 with our next presentation. Thank you, David, very much. He'll be back later today for another presentation.
Yep, and I'll be back on time.
Okay. Great. Yeah, so everyone, it's a break time. Go ahead and take a minute or two to get some coffee and come back a little bit before 9:30 because we're going to start right on time.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And I think we make up the time. We have enough time at the end, so that's what it matters, right? So thank you so much. Okay. Welcome back after the break to everyone. I think we should get started here. 9:30. So our next speaker today is Dr. Roger Baldwin. He is extension specialist at UC Davis Department of Wildlife, Fish and Conservation Biology. And the topic that he's going to cover today is managing rodents in pistachio. And Dr. Baldwin, you have 30 minutes, including Q&A. So thank you.
All righty. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to jump right in then. 30 minutes is always flies by. So I'm going to be talking specifically about managing rodents today in pistachios. So since we're going to be talking about rodents, I thought we'd first start off by providing a little bit of background information into the critters so I'm going to be covering today. So one of them that I'm obviously going to cover is the ground squirrel, or the California ground squirrel specifically. I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with ground squirrels, but if you need a quick refresher, the photo at the top right gives you an idea of what the ground squirrels look like. They're grayish brown in color, have a semi-bushy tail. They also oftentimes have a spotted or speckled, mottled or speckled type appearance to the coat that you can see there in the top right. Ground squirrels are social species, so they do live together in groups, and they're diurnal, which means they're active during the daytime. So usually it's pretty easy to tell that you have ground squirrels out there on the landscape, as opposed to some other critters where you have to use a little more investigation sometimes to figure out what's out there and what's causing damage. The damage that they do cause can be quite extensive and quite varied. It includes girdling of trees. So this photo at the bottom left gives you an idea of what some of that girdling damage can look like. Obviously, they can consume fruits and nuts, so pistachios, that's a big concern. Chewing on irrigation lines is one of the more common forms of damage that we oftentimes see with ground squirrels, resulting in millions of dollars annually throughout the state. Then their abundant burrow openings cause lots of potential problems as well, such as increased soil erosion from water channeling down through those burrow systems. They're hazards to farm workers, farm equipment, things along those lines. So lots of damage that we see from ground squirrels. A study that I was involved with years ago estimated losses in revenue of between 8.5% and 9% in nut crops when ground squirrels are present. So certainly they can cause pretty substantial damage. We're also going to spend a lot of time talking about pocket gophers today. Pocket gophers are, of course, burrowing rodents that spend the vast majority of their life below ground. So since they're spending their time below ground, we have to look for some other form of sign to know that they're present in an area. And of course, their mounds are what we're typically looking for. This photo at the bottom right gives you an idea of what a typical gopher mound will look like, oftentimes horseshoe shaped in appearance with a plug towards the lower end of one side of that mound. The damage that gophers cause can also be quite extensive and quite varied. A lot of the types of damage can be similar that we see with ground squirrels, such as increased soil erosion, hazards to farm equipment, etc. But when it comes to the actual plant damage, usually that's in the form of direct consumption of the root systems of the trees. So that's probably the most common form of damage that we see from gophers. But they will also girdle trees below ground. So when you see girdling damage from basically ground level down below, that's usually caused by gophers, and that can lead to pretty substantial losses in some cases as well. The damage that we see from gophers is most evident in fairly young trees. Once they become more mature, we start to see less damage, although occasionally they can cause substantial damage in more mature trees as well. The same study estimated losses in revenue of around 6% in nut crops for gophers. We also have meadow voles, oftentimes referred to as meadow mice. So if you're more familiar with that term, we're talking about the same critters here. They are dark grayish brown in color, about 4 to 6 inches in length. This means size-wise that they're a little bit larger than a house mouse or a deer mouse, but they're definitely smaller than a roof rat or a pocket gopher, so somewhat intermediate in size there. The really challenging aspect about voles is that their populations do tend to cycle quite a bit. And so what that means is you can have very low densities of voles for several years. In fact, you may not even really know that they're out there. And then all of a sudden, in a matter of just a few months, those populations can really explode. And it can literally feel like you are being overrun by voles. I know one study that was done in alfalfa estimated numbers at several thousand per acre when they hit their peak. So you can imagine the amount of damage that they can cause when they hit extreme peaks. When they're at the lower densities, they usually don't cause too much damage. But the primary damage that we do see from voles is girdling of trees. For voles, the girdling damage is usually from ground level up to about 6 to 8 inches above ground. So that's one way you can differentiate between that kind of girdling damage and the girdling damage from pocket gophers. They'll also chew on irrigation lines like pretty much all rodents will. And then we also have rats and mice, particularly roof rats for orchard crops, and deer mice as well. Here's a photo from almonds, but you can see the deer mouse chewing on the nuts here. We see that in pistachios as well. Same thing with roof rats. So they can certainly be damaging in cropping systems as well. Probably not their distribution, or at least as far as the amount of damage they're causing, isn't near as ubiquitous as it is for the other species. But in localized areas, these critters can cause pretty substantial losses as well. And when it comes to managing these species, we certainly do recommend that individuals utilize an integrated approach. And by integrated approach, essentially what I'm talking about is the use of multiple strategies. You'll generally find much better success, particularly long term, if you utilize multiple tools than if you were to rely on any single one approach. And there's lots of different tools that can be included in a management program, and we'll talk about a lot of those here today. But one example might be, if you have a gopher problem, maybe you start off with a bait application process to try to knock down that population. Once you get rid of a certain, subset of the individuals out there in that population, then maybe you follow that up with a trapping program afterwards to further reduce that population. The important point here is that you mix and match those tools. Don't rely on just one tool, because if you only rely on one tool, you're only going to get a certain subset of individuals in that population, and over time that subset's going to grow that you're going to be missing, and you're going to continually have more and more problems. So always make sure you try to mix and match your tools. It's also important to understand a little bit about the biology of the species that you're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that you're working in, as this can greatly influence the efficacy of management programs as well. This chart at the right-hand side, I think, does a really good job of helping to illustrate this point. This chart was designed specifically for the California ground squirrel. And what we have on this chart are major activity periods for ground squirrels, major food resources, and then the best time for control for 3 of the more commonly used strategies to manage ground squirrels. And this is broken down by the different seasons of the year. So what do we see when we look at this chart? Well, one of the first things I key in on is food resources. And we see the ground squirrels have 2 different food resources that they utilize throughout the year, but those food resources do not overlap much. In other words, they're mostly using green foliage early in the year, and later in the year they switch to seeds. This is important because if we want to use baits, particularly when I talk about bait, I'm talking about the use of rodenticide baits. You have to keep in mind that those are usually seed or pelletized products, but they're not eating seeds until later in the year. So if we want to use bait to try to manage ground squirrels, we need to wait until later in the year when they're actively feeding on those products. Using them in the springtime is generally not near as effective because they're more interested in eating green foliage at that time. So what might you use instead during the spring season? Well, we see that burrow fumigants can work quite well at that time. The reason why is that, of course, here in California, Mediterranean climate, we're getting most of our precipitation in winter through spring. And for burrow fumigants to work pretty well, we need relatively high soil moisture to close off those pores in the burrow system and hold those toxic gases in at a higher rate. And late winter through springtime is when we have that naturally occurring precipitation here. So that's the best time to use those burrow fumigants. Theoretically, if you're irrigating later in the year and you think you have sufficient soil moisture, you can certainly try to fumigate at that time as well. The soil moisture is the key component there. So these are just a couple of examples of how knowing a little bit about the biology of the species that you're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that you're working in, can greatly influence the efficacy of a management program. So with that, let's jump into some of the different tools that are out there to try to manage these species. And what I've done here initially is just show you a chart of some of the more commonly used tools to try to manage certain vertebrate pests. And what I really want you to take home from this chart is that there's just a lot of variability. There's variability across species, and there's variability within each one of these management tools. They're not always going to be good tools for every species that are out there. So for example, trapping works well for ground squirrels, works well for pocket gophers, potentially can be a useful tool for rats and mice. But for voles, they tend to be far too numerous for trapping to be a practical tool. Sometimes you'll see question marks on here, and those question marks represent situations where, maybe it works in some scenarios and not in others. So the important point that I'm trying to make with this chart is you definitely have to do a little bit of research and figure out which tools are going to work in which situations. Now, one tool that we do commonly try to utilize to manage these rodents is habitat modification. With habitat modification, what I'm talking about is altering the desirability of an area for a particular species. There's lots of examples of habitat modification that we can provide. I've had a few here for you to consider today. One of these is burrow destruction. So if you have an orchard that has extensive ground squirrel populations throughout, and they've been causing you lots of problems over the years, and you're going to take that orchard out and then go ahead and replant it, what you can do is actually try to get rid of the ground squirrels out there through a variety of different tools. And once you get rid of them, then you can go through and deep rip all those old burrow systems before you replant that orchard. And what that does is destroys those old homes for the ground squirrels. Because if you leave those burrow systems out there, if you're not ripping and destroying at a deep enough level, then adjacent populations can simply run right back into these orchards and repopulate that area quite rapidly. So how deep do you have to go? Some work by Terry Salmon done 20 years ago or so suggested that you need to be at least 1.5 feet deep. So you do have to get pretty deep to destroy those old burrow systems. 1 foot deep was not enough to substantially deter them. But it can be a good tool if you get deep enough. So I think that's a good strategy. Destroy those old burrow systems. Then you're starting off with a clean slate that will allow you to intercept those ground squirrels on the perimeter of the orchard rather than quickly allowing them to reestablish throughout. Another tool that can be used is habitat modification. Brush or pruning piles around the edge of orchards is an example of a habitat type that a lot of these critters like, including rats, mice, ground squirrels, rabbits, which I'm not talking about today, bird species, etc. So getting rid of these brush or pruning piles is a good way to get rid of some of that preferred habitat out there for these species, which can give you a leg up in trying to manage some of those problematic rodents. Probably the best example, though, of an effective habitat modification program is simply reducing cover for voles. Voles are very cover dependent. If you get rid of the cover, then they're very susceptible to predation. And so they generally move out of an area. So if you're dealing with an orchard with a cover crop, keeping that cover crop mode very low is strongly recommended if you're in an area that has substantial vole problems. Likewise, it's important to keep vegetation devoid from around the base of trees, as that also further deters voles from utilizing that area. But with proper vegetation management, vole problems can generally be quite substantially reduced and in some cases eliminated. So it's a very good tool for managing voles. But we can use exclusion for voles as well. In this case, it comes in the form of tree protectors. These are generally hard plastic structures that we put around the base of newly planted trees. They can be effective at eliminating girdling damage from voles, but it is important that if you utilize these, you do need to push them into the ground or bury them at least 4 to 6 inches below ground. If you just lay them on top of the soil, now you've created the perfect environment for voles. Basically, they can crawl underneath those structures and climb up inside that tube. And now you've created the perfect habitat, which is a food resource for them as well as cover. So if you do use them, you need to use them correctly. Otherwise, you might see more damage than if you hadn't used them at all. Of course, populations of rodents oftentimes become established in certain areas, and then we have to look for some tools to get rid of them. And trapping is one of those tools that's commonly used to try to manage a lot of these rodent species. I'm going to start off talking about ground squirrels, but we'll talk about trapping for gophers as well. But for ground squirrels, there's a variety of different kinds of traps out there. They basically fall into 2 categories, though, and those are kill traps and live traps. An example of a kill trap would be a body gripping trap, such as the Conabear 110 up here at the top right. But there's also tube or tunnel style traps and box type squeeze traps as well that can be used. The benefit of these traps is that they are kill traps, so if you capture the target animal, it kills the animal for you and you don't have to euthanize it after capture. The downside is that they're fairly indiscriminate, meaning if a non-target individual walks into one of these traps, it will catch it and kill it just as quickly as it would a ground squirrel. So you have to be very careful where you use kill traps. You would not use them where you're worried about pets frequenting an area, potentially other sensitive wildlife species that might be in the area, etc. So if you need to trap in those kind of areas, then you probably want to use these live traps. These cage traps are a common example, standard Havahart or tomahawk style cage traps. There's multi-catch traps out there as well that you can use. The benefit of these traps is that if you capture a non-target animal, the non-target animal is unharmed within the trap, and so you just open up the door and let them go. The downside of these traps is that you are responsible for euthanizing the animal after capture, and that's a step that people aren't always aware of. A lot of times they think they can just take the ground squirrel, in this case, somewhere else and release it, and you cannot do that. That is illegal in the state of California. You cannot translocate wildlife here in the state, at least without proper permitting, and you generally will not get permits to translocate pest species. So it is important that you realize that if you're going to use these live traps, you do have to euthanize the target animal after capture. Of course, you need to do so in a humane manner. There are 2 techniques we currently consider humane. One of them is shooting, so that's the simplest process. But of course, there are substantial areas where you cannot discharge a firearm. And so if that's the case, your other option is to use a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber. These are actually simple devices. You insert the trap with a ground squirrel inside, pump carbon dioxide into it, and it causes the animal to pass out and then eventually succumb to the carbon dioxide. There's instructions online for how to build one. Of course, you can buy them online, etc. If you need more information on that, there is a ground squirrel best management practices website that I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation that includes information on how to do that. The last thing I will leave you with on this particular topic is that sometimes people talk about drowning as a form of euthanasia for live trapped animals. It's important to understand, number one, that drowning is no longer considered a humane form of euthanasia, but perhaps even more importantly, here in the state of California, it is illegal to euthanize animals via drowning. So you do have to keep that in mind. I always think it's important to stress that because some of the live traps are actually still being sold with tubs to drown the animals in. And so you have to be cognizant that that is not legal here in the state. Now, trapping, of course, can also be used to manage pocket gophers. It's commonly used to manage gophers, probably more so than it is for ground squirrels. There's a variety of different kinds of traps out there on the market, but I basically lump them into two categories. Those are your pincher style traps and your squeeze type traps. So pincher style traps would include the Maccabee, the Gophinator, the Cinch trap, the Victor Easy Set, and there's a number of other pincher style traps out there as well. Squeeze type traps would include box traps like the Victor Black Box, as well as the Gopher Hawk, and some other designs out there too. One of the big questions I always get is how are any of these traps more effective than others? And the reality is, yes, some of them are a little bit more efficacious. In particular, we've spent quite a bit of time testing the Gophinator trap and the Maccabee, and what we have found is that the Gophinator trap here at the bottom right is actually more efficacious than the Gophinator or than the Maccabee trap. And the reason why is that the Gophinator allows us to capture larger gophers at a substantially greater rate. And that's what this chart at the bottom left is showcasing here. And I'm not going to bore you with the details here, but suffice it to say that as you get into the larger and larger size classes of gophers, you capture more and more when using the Gophinator. And so I do think the Gophinator is a really good trap. We've also looked at whether or not it's important to cover trap sets or if you can leave those trap sets uncovered. The reality there is, and we've tested this extensively, and what we found is it doesn't make a whole lot of difference either way. We do have slightly higher capture efficiency when using covered trap sets during hotter times of the year, but that slight increase in efficiency is offset by the amount of time it takes to cover and uncover those trap sets to the point where we were catching the same number per day. Whether or not we were using covered versus uncovered trap sets. And we actually had slightly better efficiency and higher capture rates using uncovered trap sets during fall, winter, early spring, which is kind of the more ideal time to be trapping anyways. So for me personally, I use uncovered trap sets unless I'm concerned about non-targets gaining access to the traps. And usually in an orchard setting, I'm not worried about that, but in some cases you might be. We've also looked at attractants. Here's a variety of the different kinds of attractants we looked at over the years to try to increase the efficacy of a trapping program, but they actually don't help much. Turns out gophers are really quite easy to catch in traps, particularly if you have a little bit of experience at it, and utilizing an attractant just didn't increase our ability to catch them any. We have also looked at human scent. Do we need to exclude human scent from trap sets? Or can we touch traps with bare hands and feel around in tunnel systems with bare fingers and things like that? And this was very clear. Human scent had no impact at all. So feel free to do whatever you want to do with those traps. Again, the gophers are not really all that challenging to trap for the most part. So we've talked about some tools to increase the efficacy of a trapping program, but we still really haven't talked about how efficacious those trapping programs are. Turns out they're very efficacious. We've seen 92 to 94% removal after 2 trapping sessions through a field. So trapping is really an excellent tool when it comes to managing gophers. Of course, we can use bait as well to manage rodents. With baiting, I'm talking about the use of rodenticides or toxic baits. They can be restricted use and non-restricted use depending upon how they're used and who's using them. But generally speaking, from an agricultural perspective, they're almost always restricted use products. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the toxicants which are used for field rodents. And those are the first generation anticoagulants, zinc phosphide, and strychnine. The first generation anticoagulants include chlorphacinone and diphacinone. These are chronic feed materials that require consumption over the course of several days to get a lethal dose. We also have acute toxicants which kill after a single feed. Those are zinc phosphide and strychnine. Now for rats and mice, it's a little bit more complicated. If we're talking about around structures, so around buildings and things like that, there's a certain suite of tools you can use, such as bromethylene, cholecalciferol, and second generation anticoagulants. You cannot use those for field applications, though. You can only use the first generation anticoagulant products there. So that's all I'm going to talk about for rats and mice. When we start talking about use around buildings, we're now talking about a structural pest issue, and that's different. So I'm not going to talk about that today. As far as bait application for ground squirrels is concerned, and voles for that matter, they can be used via spot treatments, broadcast applications, or in bait stations. Spot treatments are used when you have just a few burrow systems to treat. You take a designated amount of bait and spread it very thinly around the entrance of that burrow opening. This bottom left photo is an example of how not to apply bait via a spot treatment. What they've done in this situation is they've piled up bait. They have not spread it thinly around that burrow entrance. And so now you have all kinds of non-target issues associated with animals coming along and feeding on that bait. If you apply it the way you're supposed to, there would just be a few grains per square foot of this product out there. And in that situation, there are very few animals adapted to be able to pick up enough of that grain to get a lethal dose. So if used properly, it can be safe, but if used like this, it can be a very dangerous tool to use. Of course, this is fine if you have a few burrow systems to treat, but if you have larger areas to treat, we oftentimes utilize broadcast applications, which is where you use a calibrated seed spreader to broadcast the bait out there. That can be an effective tool. But in orchard settings, more times than not, individuals utilize bait stations. Bait stations are oftentimes used along the perimeter of orchards to intercept reinvading ground squirrels, and sometimes are used within the orchards themselves. Just keep in mind that these first generation anticoagulants are a multiple feed product, so the animal does need to consume the bait over the course of several days. That means for spot treatments and broadcast applications, you have to reapply the bait a second time, usually 4 days after the initial application. And with bait stations, you need to check the bait stations regularly to make sure that they're maintaining a constant bait supply. Now we can also use zinc phosphide, which is an acute toxin, so it kills after a single feed, so you can get pretty rapid knockdown with zinc phosphide. The problem with it is that it has a distinctive odor and taste, kind of a garlicky type odor and taste that animals don't always necessarily take to all that well. And so what can happen is they might eat just a few grains of this product. That can cause them to get sick, but not enough to kill them. And then they learn to avoid that bait in the future. So because of that, you're generally only allowed to apply the bait 1 time per year. That's to minimize the likelihood of bait shyness developing in the entire population. So keep that in mind. You get 1 opportunity per year to use it. Also, because of that distinctive odor and taste associated with it, we only use it for spot treatments and broadcast applications. We don't put it in bait stations because that magnifies that odor. And because it's an acutely toxic material, we do not use it in or around buildings. You have to be away from structures to use it. So always read the label and we'll tell you where you can use it. For pocket gophers, we can use strychnine, first generation anticoagulants, and zinc phosphide, but I can tell you that strychnine has consistently tested to be the most efficacious, far more efficacious than most of the other tools, or the other rodenticides out there. It can be applied in a funnel and spoon method. That's fine for a few burrow systems, but in reality, you're probably going to use one of these all-in-one probe and bait dispensers, which allow you to treat areas far more rapidly, or perhaps you consider using a burrow builder, which creates an artificial burrow system. The problem with these devices is that you have to have some experience using them, know how to use them properly to formulate the right depth of tunnel systems to make sure that they're maintaining an open tunnel system, etc. So there's some tricks to utilizing this particular tool. It isn't always quite as efficacious as you might think it would be, but it's definitely the easiest to use as far as, or quickest to use to treat areas. For deer and mice, we can also use first generation anticoagulants in bait stations as long as they're elevated. We've seen very good success for roof rats and deer mice in almonds. No reason to believe they wouldn't work well in pistachio orchards as well. If you want more information on that, we do have an entire publication devoted to bait application for roof rats and deer mice. And so I certainly encourage you to check that out if you need more information on that. Very quickly, burrow fumigants, as I mentioned, are also used. They can be, there's several different kinds out there. Gas cartridges are pretty effective for ground squirrels, about 75% efficacy, but they do not work well for gophers. So we really don't recommend their use for gophers. The nice thing about gas cartridges is that they are not a restricted use product. So you do not have to be a certified applicator to use them. Aluminum phosphide, on the other hand, is more efficacious and cheaper to use than gas cartridges, but they are also a highly restricted use product. So there's a few more hoops to jump through. One thing I didn't mention, but with these burrow fumigants, you always have to be careful where you use them. Never use them next to structures because If that burrow system goes underneath the building, those gases can leak up and that can cause all kinds of problems. Lastly, for the fumigants, we also have pressurized exhaust systems, and there's a variety of different pressurized exhaust systems out there. We've tested this one quite a bit, the PERC machine. Found it to be moderately efficacious for gophers and pretty darn effective for ground squirrels. This 100% efficacy was in ideal moist conditions, but we even saw 66% efficacy in really dry conditions when fumigants generally do not work well. So they seem to be very good for ground squirrels, moderately good for pocket gophers. We've also looked at the cheetah rodent control machine, which is this leaf blower type device, and it did not work well for us for ground squirrels. I will quickly mention that there are all kinds of repellents out there for these critters. Most of them do not work well, but we've looked at one, which is anthraquinone, which causes a post-ingestive response in the animal. That's basically a fancy way of saying that if they eat a little bit of it, it causes them to get sick, and then they learn to avoid it. And so we've tested this on newly planted trees, and we found that it was very effective at reducing girdling damage from voles. We're very optimistic about this product. It's not currently registered, but it is going through the registration process, and so it is something you might be able to consider for newly planted trees here in the next year or two. And then last thing, shooting can be used as a tool for managing ground squirrels, but it is labor intensive and it's challenging in an orchard system. So maybe not the best tool in orchard systems, but if you do use it, realize that lead bullets are now banned statewide. And so that has some implications. The last thing I'll leave you with is the Ground Squirrel Best Management Practices website. If you need more information about that, I encourage you to check that out, groundsquirrelbmp.com. And I doubt we have time for questions, but I do think you have some poll questions for everybody, right?
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Baldwin. And yeah, we'll have some poll question. We'll go first there, and then if we have time, then we'll get back to Q&A.
Sure.
Doesn't look like we'll have time this time, but if you don't mind to stay for a few minutes and answer those questions on the chat, would be appreciated.
Sure.
So you should see the poll on your screen. There are 3 questions. Go ahead and submit your answers. I'll give you another 30 seconds. And then, yeah, we'll probably move on to the next speaker. So Roger, you could type, after you go over the poll, you can type some answers to the questions that are in the Q&A. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. If you could go over them real quick, Roger.
Yeah, sure. It is legal to translocate live trapped animals off your property. Definitely false. You are not allowed to do that. So it's always important to keep that in mind if you're going to utilize live trapping as a tool. Burrow fumigants cannot be used in close proximity to buildings. That is absolutely true. You have to be some set distance. Depending upon the product you're using, it's oftentimes 100 feet from a structure. And lastly, use of multiple tools generally results in more effective management of burrowing rodents. Almost everybody got this one, so that's great. Yes, we definitely want to utilize an integrated approach there. So with that, I will let you guys take over and I will answer some questions.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, well, for the next topic that we're going to cover is about weed management, and the presenter for that topic is Dr. Brad Hansen. Dr. Hansen is weed science specialist, cooperative extension specialist at UC Davis Department of Plant Sciences. So without delay, I would like Dr. Hansen to take over for the presentation. And just a reminder, everybody, if you have any questions for any speaker, you can put that in the Q&A sections of your screen. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, as I said, and we'll get started here so I can hopefully have time for a few questions as we get through the presentation. So this is probably absolutely Weed Science 101. I think anybody who works in agriculture knows that weed management is part of the deal. You know, every acre, every year has some kind of weed management and to have reasonable crop productivity. But just to make sure we're all on the same starting point here, especially in young orchards, but this is true to a certain extent in older orchards as well, the direct competition for water, nutrients, and light in the case of young trees is an important part of this. This interference, of course, is especially problematic during the establishment years. If you look at the photo in the upper right here, that's actually a young pistachio orchard, a brand new planting that went in following, I think, cotton down in Kern County. And you could imagine that if the weeds weren't controlled in that field, that those trees would really be set back, probably in a way that would impact them maybe for the majority of their lifespan. This orchard actually was cleaned up shortly after I took this photo, but certainly you could imagine the competition for resources being a huge impact there. Probably more so in most of our orchards after the establishment years is the impact that weeds have on other management practices, harvest in some cases, irrigation, control of vertebrate pests. Since I'm following Roger, I'll throw that out there. This is, just the impact of the presence of weeds can be problematic just for orchard operations, as well as can, in some cases, change the orchard humidity and create microclimates that can be negatively impactful. Probably not as much in pistachio as in other crops like grapes in that lower right-hand photo. In certain cases, there are crop quality concerns, although that tends not to be such an issue in the pistachio production system. But in a lot of our annual crops or in crops like almonds or walnuts that are harvested off the orchard floor, there can be quality issues, or wine grapes, for example, can have some quality issues if you bring in a lot of weed material with that harvested product. So what's different about weeds versus a lot of our other pest management? I would say, hypothesize or throw out there that one of the big differences that we're dealing with lots of species all at the same time. When we're talking about management of an insect pest or a pathogen, oftentimes we're thinking about them one at a time because it's time for bloom pests, or it's hull split in almonds, where you've got specific problems at specific times. During the course of a year of annual weed management, we're dealing with annuals and perennials and even biennial weeds in some cases. We've got a mix of grasses and sedges and spring emergers and winter emergers, as well as different reproductive strategies, seeded annuals versus a lot of our perennial weeds that spread by both seed and vegetative propagules. So it's really difficult to have a one-stop shopping for managing all those different kinds of weeds over the course of the year. So what kind of factors affect orchard weed management? First of all, orchard age and arrangement is part of that. I mentioned, early on, I showed you that photo of competition with young orchards. Certainly in a young orchard, we've got a lot more weed problems because there's less shading, so the crop is less competitive directly with the weeds. Also, the potential impacts are much greater. So we spend a lot of time thinking about weed management in those young orchards. Once we have an established pistachio, pistachios are probably the most open orchards of the tree nuts. But even in pistachios, once we have established trees, we capture a lot of the light, which really can reduce the productivity of the weeds on in the lower part of the on the orchard floor. Irrigation type, timing, and amount all affect both weed problems as well as longevity of our herbicide programs. Typically we end up with a lot more weed problems where there's, say, furrow irrigation, which we don't tend to see very much anymore in pistachios, but we'll typically see more weeds in sprinkler irrigated fields because there's a greater, 100% of the orchard floor is wetted, less so in micros and often even less so in drip. Conversely, we see herbicides break faster where the soil is wetted longer and more frequently. So typically our herbicides last less. The longevity is reduced in furrow and drip irrigated, although in drip it would be in a relatively smaller area of that orchard, just where that wetted zone. Tillage practices that are used or can be used is an important part of weed management. If we've got an orchard that's planted on berms or has irrigation systems, our opportunities for cross disking or physical weed control are greatly reduced. Conversely, some people will actually set up an orchard that allows these other, set up the irrigation system, for example, or the orchard spacing in such a way that operations can be done in multiple directions. Herbicide options, this is the way that most of our pistachio orchards have a chemical weed management program. And I'll spend a bit of time in a few minutes talking about herbicides registered in pistachios. And then lastly, orchard access. What I had in here was kind of time of year access. So in certain cases and in certain regions, we can have more difficult time accessing orchards during the winter, and that's going to depend on the vegetation management in the middles. That is not typically the biggest limitation in the bulk of the pistachio production regions in California, but depending where you are in the state, that can be an important part of orchard management, orchard and vineyard management decisions, weed management decisions. So I want to talk just briefly, probably like the other speakers have, in terms of integrated pest management, but just like the other pest classes, using multiple strategies to manage weeds is always important. And we do this, whether maybe in some cases, whether we realize it or not, but anything that we can do to manage the crop in a way that favors the crop and disfavors the weeds, or disfavors the non-crop, I would say, is part of an integrated management strategy. Some of these are a little bit more subtle, or maybe not the main point, and that could be planting density and water management. And others are much more direct. That could be things like the chemical and mechanical weed control. But layering multiple strategies is definitely an important part of weed management, just like it is any other pest management class. When I think of integrated pest management, specifically thinking about weeds, we have a lot of both long and short-term goals. In the long term, I think anything we can do to reduce spread of weeds or introduction of new weeds, weed species into the orchard is important. So that's things like cleaning equipment and being aware of weed biology, so that we can reduce seed set. That photo in the lower right is one that I took years ago that I get a lot of mileage out of. That is actually showing it's annual sow thistle, I believe, with the seeds blowing in from the edge of a field. So when you have these wind-blown seeds, we need to manage the weeds in the orchard, but also around the orchard because of that constant reintroduction. And that can also happen with movement of soil or weed propagules on or in equipment. A lot of what we do is delaying or suppressing weed growth. So that's things like that spring tillage operation, or perhaps mowing, where we're knocking the weeds back. We maybe aren't killing those weeds with a mower, but we're reducing that growth and the competitive ability, as well as preventing or suppressing weed seed production. So that's part of that long-term strategy. Over time, in many cases, we do what we can to reduce the seed bank and soil. And that's probably less so the issue in pistachios, but where we can flush weeds with irrigation practices, or use our depth of tillage to encourage germination of weeds that we can easily control later, we will eventually reduce the seeds in that soil. Reducing the seed bank is not as easily done as reducing the additions of seed to that soil. So really managing weed seed production is probably the lever that we have the most ability to move in the orchard system. However, the one benefit of orchards versus some of the other annual crops, we tend to do less tillage, so less deep tillage rather, because most weeds tend to germinate in the top ½ inch or inch. We're not constantly bringing up new seed from the deeper portion of the seed bank. And so with good management, you actually can reduce weed pressure over time in the orchard system. So I've got just a few slides to just sort of remind us, kind of thinking about weed management. Weed identification is really an important part of this. If you don't know what weed you're trying to manage, or don't at least have some idea of the life cycle and the biology of that plant, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. Basically, no technique equally controls all weed species. Not all weeds are as much of a problem actually in the orchard system. So we need to think about, how big of a problem is this particular weed, and how much of an effort do I need to put into controlling it. Different species respond differently to different control strategies as well. And that could even be within a species. And I'm thinking here specifically about herbicide resistant biotypes. So weed ID, at least a general sense of the weeds that you're trying to control is important. And there's lots of ways to identify weeds. I've circled one here at the Weed Research and Information Center, but there's a lot of online resources. There's weed ID books, a couple in my stack here. More kind of more detailed, I would say, weed ID software. This is a screenshot of a set that I use from XID services that are basically dichotomous keys where you can narrow down a list of hundreds of weed species down to just a few that you can then identify from photos. So there's lots of resources out there for weed identification. Better and better resources in recent years with cell phone apps and so on too, but I don't think we're quite there in most cases for we can identify a lot of common weeds that way, but the unusual ones, usually you've got to find a little bit more detailed reference or online resource, electronic resource. So I'll just flip through what a few of these look like. What I liked with some of these, like the one at the Weed Research and Information Center, well, this one is free. This isn't a huge database. I think there's 300 or 400 common weed species in California. But this is really good for those of us who, like me, are not taxonomists. Basically, you can pick you've got a weed in your hand and you can pick a few kind of general categories, leaf shape and leaf margins and so on. And just narrow that list down to a handful. So like in this particular case, whatever I selected in that first screen, I narrowed my list of 300 down to 27. And so then you can start looking at pictures and decide what looks most like the one you've got in your hand, and at least get yourself in the right neighborhood. The UCIPM website has a number of weed ID keys and helpful characteristic guides as well. It can be a good resource. But I want to get into the management part of this. Identification and scouting is important, but let's talk management. One of the things that I think about a lot in the orchard and vineyard system is the different management zones. We certainly spend a lot more time and effort and expense managing the weeds right in the crop row, because those weeds in the middle are a lot easier to manage. We have more tools, particularly tillage and mowing, that we can do out in the middles that are more difficult to do around the base of the pistachio trees, and or around the irrigation system. The management also can differ quite significantly during the life of the orchard, especially because of concerns related to crop injury from physical practices and chemical strategies. So I want to run through a few of the broad categories of how we manage weeds in any crop. And I'll dig into a few of these a little bit more deeply over the next few minutes. First, I've already touched on sanitation. This is just good maintenance of weeds around the margins of the field or the orchard, roads, canals, cleaning equipment before it comes into the field, so that we're not bringing more seed into the system, or particularly introducing new weeds that are not currently there. So this is really important for the novel or introduction of new species. Cultural practices, I touched on a little bit. This is really all of those agronomic and horticultural practices that we do. And many of those we can tweak in ways that, get that fertilizer more closely to where the crop can get it and less to where the weeds are going to be able to utilize that fertilizer or water, et cetera, et cetera. Mechanical control, this is things like mowing and tillage particularly. I'll touch on just a minute on biologicals, and then I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about chemical weed control over the next few minutes. So sanitation, I think I actually already said most of this, but I'll just point out here, scouting and managing the weeds in the orchard is really important. So much like weed identification, scouting the fields is really important, because you want it, you can only see so much of the orchard from driving by in the from the road or from the field roads, from the field margins. Getting out in the orchard is really important. That's primarily because you can address new problems while they're still a small problem, rather than once they're widespread problems. So those new invaders, those failures in small areas, we can put a lot more effort into managing weeds in a small area of the orchard, rather than waiting until we have to manage 100% of the orchard because we let a problem get away from us a few years earlier. Yeah, and I've actually already talked about all these. Really, scouting can help us with the new weed problems, the new invaders, and that's probably where I would really focus my effort in terms of orchard scouting. Cultural practices, I did touch on this already. Mostly what I think about in the orchard system is the irrigation and fertilizer management. I talked about this with the furrow irrigation versus micro irrigation or drip irrigation. In a lot of ways, we're really spoon feeding that input, the water or fertilizer in that case, and trying to get it right into the root zone of the pistachios in our case, such that the weeds have less access to it. If we're not wetting the whole orchard floor, we're going to have much fewer weed problems across the middles and so on. Canopy management, this is not so much of an issue in pistachios, although planting density and arrangement can help us capture more of the sunlight and faster, especially early in the orchard lifespan, so that we can create more shade so that the weeds are disfavored. In some orchard crops, there's a lot more interest in cover crops, and we're working on that in a number of tree nut orchards, although pistachios not as much at this point. In some crops, we use physical and biological mulches as well. That could be things like plastic films, textile fabric, and so on. That's typically not done in pistachios, at least that I'm aware. Flaming and thermal weeders, this is an area of increasing interest as well. So there are ways to use heat or steam to damage weeds without damaging the tree crop. And then in a few cases, there has been work with animals, grazing animals, sheep, goats in particular. I have not seen this in pistachios to any great degree, and there are crop safety and also food safety issues in some of our orchard crops, but this is done to a degree in vineyards and some of our perennial crops. Cover crops, this is a bit of a generic slide set, so I won't, since we don't do this too much in pistachios, I'll move through this relatively quickly. But in the systems that do use cover crops, there's a lot of different types. It could be things like the cereals in the upper left here, that is a relatively low cost. Lower left, I think that's a pollinator mix of different kinds of diverse cover crop mixtures for different ecosystem services. In some cases, there are perennial sod forming grasses, but that tends to not be very common in our orchard systems. Some of the advantages and disadvantages of cover crops. One, in areas with more rainfall, sometimes that winter orchard access can be important if you need to get in and do dormant sprays and so on. Having a vegetation in the middles is much better than bare soil in terms of just being able to support heavy equipment. In areas that have topography, soil erosion, and concurrently the pesticide and fertilizer that can run off with that soil and water moving off site can be reduced with cover crops. A lot of cover crops are done with the goal of adding organic matter and sequestering carbon. And then there are benefits from a soil structure standpoint, which can help with water and root penetration over time. And cover crops do compete with weeds. That's the main, my perspective as a weed scientist, that's why I'm interested, is that direct competition of what I describe as vegetation that you can predict and control to displace the vegetation that is harder to predict and harder to control. There are disadvantages to cover crops. Primarily, you're managing another crop within your primary crop, and that can take different kinds of equipment. Depending on the crop, the cover crop, and when it's used, that's plants that compete also with your crop for water and nutrients. In certain crops, frost concerns are a problem, especially the early flowering tree crops and grapes. Vertebrate insect pests are probably one of the largest challenges that I see, where you've got cover, you're going to have potential more problems with gophers and voles and moles and so on. And then in the vineyard system, they're sometimes wanting to reduce nitrogen, but that's not the problem in pistachios. Just a couple points about flame or thermal heating. This is a non-chemical approach, so the increasing interest in organic and non-pesticidal methods of weed control, there's a benefit there. There is a relatively high carbon footprint because you are using considerable amount of propane or some kind of fuel to create that flame or steam or hot air, depending on your system. Just if you use this, remember you're just needing to heat the plants. You don't need to actually turn them into charcoal. This is a matter of heating the cell contents so that the cell walls burst and then they desiccate. You don't have to actually burn them. This typically works best on small broadleaf plants. It doesn't tend to work as well on grasses because the growing point is below the ground. They'll regrow relatively easily. There's no residual control, which is both a benefit and a detriment depending on your goals. There is some risk of damage to young trees or burning or melting irrigation systems and so on, or setting wildfires. So certainly not without impact. But this is a way that particularly some organic growers can use for weed control. I already talked about animals to a degree. We tend not to see this in pistachios. I would say this can be used to suppress vegetation. It can work pretty well or very poorly, depending on how and when it's implemented. This is one of those things that's really kind of an interesting quandary about, it's expensive, right? Do you own these animals and you've got to feed them and manage them year round? Do you rent them like a weed control service? And there are operators that do that. It does take a lot of management effort to move, to have the grazing intensity sufficient. Plus you have to manage the animal welfare in terms of available feed, water, protection from predators, and so on. Grazing animals, particularly goats, but also sheep to a degree, can damage young trees or vines because they will browse on what they can reach. And then with the crops, many of our crops, there are food safety concerns. That's especially true of almonds and walnuts, where we harvest them off the orchard floor. Mechanical weed control, this is basically tillage, mowing, and to a lesser extent, hand labor. This is really pretty easily done in middles, between the rows of pistachios or vines in the photos here. Much more difficult to do within the row, just because the crop's in the way and also the irrigation system. And there's risk. The closer you are to the crown of that tree, the more greater chance of causing physical damage, which itself can reduce the, let me go forward a slide here. Detriments rather. So disadvantages, fuel cost, it's slow, you can cause trunk and root injury. A lot of our dust, physical weed control creates dust, so that can be a problem from some of our impacted air basins. I know I'm getting towards the end of my time here, so I want to move relatively quickly through this, but I think few people are familiar with cultivation, both pros and cons. Mowing is another one. This is very commonly used in a lot of our tree nut orchards. I would describe mowing mostly as a weed suppression tactic, really good for reducing seed set, especially of erect or upright growing annuals. This can be sort of split the difference between tillage and non-tillage in terms of orchard access and erosion benefits. Weeds are suppressed, but they still do use some water and nutrients. Mowing, repeated mowing over years does tend to favor low growing and perennial weeds. I'm thinking here like knotweed, field bindweed, and so on. But you'll have a much greater impact on those upright growing annuals because you reduce seed set pretty quickly. Mowing can favor grasses, much as I mentioned with the thermal methods. The growing point of grasses is below ground, so we, for the same reason you use mowing in your lawn, the grasses tolerate that much better than broadleaf plants do. Mowing can be fairly costly because it's a slow and frequent operation in the orchard. So this has its own fuel and input costs. A few slides to talk generally about chemical weed control. This is by far the biggest way that weeds are controlled in pistachios. We typically use intensive herbicide programs in the tree row. In a pistachio, we're probably looking at somewhere between 25 and 50% of the orchard floor, with the remainder managed with mowing or tillage or less intensive programs. In almonds and walnuts, we often do a pre-harvest application across that orchard floor to remove the vegetation that could impact off-ground that would impact nut recovery from the orchard floor. Our herbicides are divided in, I just think about them, well, we slice them a lot of different ways, but pre-emergent herbicides are those that we apply to ideally bare soil. These are our residual herbicides that affect germinating seeds, and to a less, some also affect seedlings, but mostly we're affecting very early stage weeds. A lot of these can provide residual effect lasting weeks or even months, depending on the product and the rate. Our post-emergent herbicides, these are the ones that we apply to existing vegetation. They could be burn down treatments. They could be contact herbicides that only affect the tissue that is directly sprayed. And a few of the orchard herbicides are translocated, which means that they can be taken into the plant and moved to other parts down to the roots and non-treated leaves and so on. A few of our post-emergent herbicides also have residual soil activity, but many do not. So be aware of what you're working with. So how do we pick herbicides? Well, first of all, they have to be registered for use in the crop. You know, you and I as weed managers can't just use any herbicide that we want in pistachios or any other crop. They have to have been tested and approved for that use in the state. We want to be aware of the weeds that we're trying to control. I already talked about weed ID, so I won't belabor that here. The toxicity and safety, that's for the crop, which helps drive the registration. We want to make sure it's safe, but also that the use pattern is safe from food safety, off-target movement, and so on. For a lot of our pre-emergent herbicides, the soil type and texture is an important part of our rate decisions in certain cases. Oftentimes where we have sandy, light soils, we can use much lower rates because we get better weed control with low rates, but also the crop safety tends to be better. Conversely, in really heavy clay, high organic matter soils, we may have to increase the rate to get acceptable weed control. That has to do with how the herbicides are bound to that fine soil texture or the organic matter and what's available for the weeds to take up. And the cost, of course, these are often very costly or moderately to very costly materials, so that plays into the decision-making process as well. There are a lot of herbicides registered in pistachio. I've just got them listed here. I think you've got course material, so I won't go into this too much. But we've got a couple of dozen herbicides probably that are registered both in the pre-emergent class. These are some example trade names, but many of these are off patent, and there's generics and multiple herbicides with these active ingredients. So I'm not going to go into this too much here, but I will point out, and I've got at the end of this slide, this figure in the lower left is a chart that I have put together just primarily for my own use about what herbicides are registered in tree and vine crops. And I try to update that regularly. So there's a lot of herbicides used. We don't use them all equally. I've got some data here from DPR 2017 compared to the 2011 pistachio use pattern, herbicide use. So these are sprayed acres. So I just would point out here, glyphosate, these are the Roundup type products. Glufosinate, that would be things like Rely 280, and there's a number of products in that class. Oxyflorphin is the goaltender type products. And you can see on down the list here. But my point here is we put a lot of effort, we spend a lot of our weed management dollars on a relatively few, a narrow suite of herbicides, particularly glyphosate, but also a number of post-emergent herbicides like glufosinate, saflufenicil, paraquat. These are all post materials. I would also point out that these are sprayed acres. So that's different than orchard acres, thinking about the way we spray mostly in the strips. So yeah, so the sprayed acres here, these are our important data. Just a few more slides I want to get through. Conventional herbicides can be very cost effective because they provide a lot of weed control for the dollar. The disadvantages, some of them are very costly. So we all have to decide kind of what our economic threshold is for the weed management versus the cost of that application. They tend to have quite consistent results. They're relatively easy to apply, especially with regard to speed, especially in comparison to slower operations like tillage or mowing. Crop safety is generally good, although not universal. So that's we do have concerns on occasion. With some of the residual herbicides, we can get season-long control, which is really important in a mild climate like in California, where we can get year-round. A couple applications might give us pretty good year-round weed control. And some of these herbicides are selective. If we want to maintain the grasses but control the broadleaves, we might have tools that can do that, or vice versa. Disadvantages, some concerns about off-site movement with some products, whether by drift or movement in water or movement into the, if they're water soluble, there can be groundwater issues with just a few of our herbicides. Pesticides are highly regulated, so the record keeping is laborious and important. There are cases of herbicide resistance, so this can fail if we don't manage and steward the products. Crop injury can occur. This doesn't happen often, but we do occasionally see it, especially if there's a misapplication or an unusual, say, rainfall event or unusual soil or something like that. And there's a growing interest from some market sectors about reducing herbicide use altogether or reducing use of specific products.
Brad?
Yeah.
We've reached the time. You can take like another minute or so to wrap it up, because we have a break, so we do have a little bit of wiggle room. But
okay, very good. I don't think I'll belabor this here too much then, because I want to get to just my final couple of slides. Let's see, new weed problems. Herbicide resistance, as I mentioned, because of glyphosate resistance and because of the importance of glyphosate, that's the resistance issues. Let me see. So young orchards can be the biggest challenge, particularly because we often have a bigger impact of weed competition, but also we have fewer tools. With a lot of our herbicides can't be used in pistachios till their third leaf. So I'll just wrap up here saying your weed ID is important. Use integrated multiple tactics where feasible. When you're using herbicides, make sure you're using the right herbicide because the target weed species and using it at the best time, and be aware of the potential off-target problems. Then lastly, I'll say here, weed management is a year in, year out part of the production system. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for orchard weed management. So this is really, you need to manage the weeds in your orchard based on your scouting and weed ID and consultation with the pest control advisor. So I'll put this up here one more time, and then I will stop because I know we've got our quiz, and then we'll get on to, I assume, David Haviland's next, since I saw him log in here a moment ago.
Yeah, thank you, Brad, for your presentation. I think, we don't have time to answer questions, but we'll have those in a Q&A section. If you don't mind to stay there, a few minutes and answer those would be appreciated. So thank you.
Yep, thanks, Shalendra. I'll stick around and answer a few questions.
Yeah, and I've gone ahead and launched the poll. There are 3 questions. They should be up on your screen now. You can go ahead and answer them. Go ahead and submit. You'll have about a minute to do it. Brad will type answers to the Q&A questions that are in the Q&A. And then once we get about our responses in, he will address these questions here. So go ahead, another minute to fill out the poll question that's on your screen. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and share results. If you could just go over it, Brad, real quick, that would be great. And you are muted.
Yep, thank you. So the mowing question, basically repeated mowing will typically select for grasses and low growing species. So, it depends on what species you're talking about here. You will reduce seed production of erect annual broadleaves, probably will not greatly reduce grasses. So that one is true-ish. That's probably 50-50. So that's probably a good answer there. If a herbicide is registered in the crop, it is, you can get many answers on that one. So if it's registered in the crop, it suggests to me that research has been done that suggests that it can be safely used for one reason or another. But it can be used in the crop in the state that it's registered in. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so that third answer, that's the one that I think is the right answer. So yes, studies have been done year over year. Primary advantage of flame weeders, they do control emerged vegetation or suppress vegetation. They typically do not control weed seeds because they don't heat the soil. The dwell time and the duration of thermal activity is too short to damage seeds. Even on the soil surface, we don't see weed seed destruction. So, thank you.
Okay, so I think we're gonna take a break. I'm gonna give you guys 10 minutes, so we're gonna come back at 10:50. That means we're starting about 5 minutes behind schedule. So yes, come back at 10:50. Brad will answer the questions that are in Q&A by typing currently. Go ahead, take a break if you need it, and then David's presentation will begin at 10:50.
Okay, well, we hit 10:50, so I think we should start. So our next speaker is David Haviland. He's UC Corporate Extension Entomology Advisor in Kern County. And the topic that he's going to cover today is integrated pest management, annual plans, and other resources related to pistachio. So with that, I'll hand over to David.
So, okay, so this talk is sort of a catch-all talk. And the way I would frame this is, you've heard a lot of talks from a lot of people that are, let's say, giving you fish. Now it's time to teach you how to fish. And what I mean by that is, there is a ton of information out there on pest management that we obviously can't cover in 20 to 40-minute talks. So I'm going to try and go through what some of those resources are for you. That way you and your pest control advisors, whoever it is, can actually go out and tap into some of these resources. Lots and lots of time and effort have gone into every one of them, and they all have their own specific values. So the first resource to talk about is the Pistachio Production Manual. So this was done fairly recently. It's actually one of the most recent manuals the University of California has put out from 2016. 321 pages. It's got more than 200 pictures. In fact, a lot of pictures that you've seen in the presentations over the last, over this conference, so short course, are in there. It's got 60 diagrams. So that's diagrams on, cycles of weeds, diagrams on life cycles of insects, that kinds of things, as well as production. There's 42 different authors. Most of those are from the University of California, but it also includes people from other universities, USDA, and so on. There's 28 different chapters, and 9 of those chapters relate to pest management specifically. Okay, so that's a weeds chapter that Brad was very influential in helping to develop. 2 chapters on weeds. One is basically below ground, one's above ground. 7 different chapters on insects and mites, and then a vertebrates section. And then I state here, it's written to withstand time. So what I mean by that is, the strength of this manual is it's got the good hardcore biology information, the life cycle information, the degree days, monitoring tools. It's got all that kind of stuff that stays consistent from year to year. What it does not have is insecticides. As you know, products disappear and products appear every single year. So that's not the place, the manual's not the place for that. But for all those other things about just general integrated pest management, understanding pests, pictures of what they look like in different stages, all the biological control, pictures of those and so on, this book is for you. It's available at the ANR catalog. It's also available at Amazon. It's available at Google Play if you want to just have it digital on your tablet. I can't remember the exact cost of it, but I mean, we're talking like $40. Okay, it's literally the cost of printing. The goal is not to make money on it from our standpoint. The goal is to get it in your hands and make it available for you to use. So if you don't have this book, get it. I've got people like pest control advisors that say every year I hire scouts and I try to make sure these scouts know what they're looking for and so on. and they just pull this book out with the scouts and they go through page by page, pointing to pictures, showing people what to do. So lots and lots and lots of uses. Please get it. The best resource out there. So the second major resource that's out there is what we call the pest management guidelines. These are from the UC statewide integrated pest management program. The information is distilled. So people from UC, for example, on the weeds, since Brad just finished speaking, people like Brad look at all the trials that have been done in pistachios, but also all the trials that have been done in almonds and tree crops and other crops. They pull all that information together and they say, okay, at the end of the day, we're not going to show any research results. Let's just say, what do growers and their pest control advisors need to know to manage weeds? Boom, that gets summarized. It's right there. Okay, no citations, no big cumbersome charts, just how you do it and what you do. So I'd encourage you to take advantage of these pest management guidelines. I'll actually show it to you in just a minute here, but there's guidelines for 14 different insects, 9 diseases, for nematodes, for weeds, and for 5 different invertebrates. At the bottom of the page down here, I put the website if you want to go to that directly. When you get to that landing page, there'll be 4 different options. The 2 options on the top, one is for information for landscape, backyard, homeowner kinds of people, and the other link is for the agricultural pest section. Just click on the ag pest section, click on pistachios, and it'll come right up. Now there's some other resources from UC IPM. One of those is a year-round IPM program, and I'll show you that in just a minute. And this addresses one of the weaknesses in the previous things I showed you. So for example, on the last slide I show you, there's guidelines on 9 different pests. All the information on those pests that's important is there. But if you were to ask the question, right now it is May. Out of all of those pests, which ones do I care about and what should I be doing about them in May? Well, if you just reference the guidelines, you'd have to go back and read every one of them to figure that out. Whereas the year-round program is basically a calendar that breaks down the guidelines into periods throughout the year that tells you what you should be doing for each different kind of pest. There's also degree day calculators. There's guides on there for pesticide toxicity. So if you want to know the products that I'm using, what impact might they have on honeybees? What might they have on natural enemy parasitoids, predators, and things like that? That information is in there. There's some great tables on fungicide properties and fungicide efficacy and timing. As an entomologist in particularly, I'll tell you, I get really confused on the fungicides. There's so many of them. There's so many different modes of actions. And, this one's better for this disease. That one's better for that disease. This one doesn't work on either, but does, controls a third disease if you use it at a certain time. That kind of guideline is in there. There's also a weed susceptibility chart in there, things that Brad could have never gone through in this talk. In fact, I saw one of the comments or one of the questions was about alkali weed. Okay, if you've got a question, what herbicide specifically works on this annual broadleaf that emerges in the spring? There's tables that you can cross-reference to try to figure that out. Especially if you've got 3 or 4 particular weeds you're trying to control at the same time, you can go through the charts and find which specific herbicide will control all of those at one time. There's some guides to natural enemies on there with lots of pictures, and there's how-to videos. So I'm not going to go through all those. I'm just going to say, do some exploring. It's worth your time. It's all free, and it's all accessible from your tablet or computer, regardless of where you are. Now, as far as some other online publications, I've just picked a few to point out. There's an ANR publication that's called Managing Glyphosate-Resistant Weeds in Orchards and Vineyards. Brad mentioned how much reliance the industry is putting on glyphosate these days. So there are some weeds that aren't being controlled as well as they used to be by that herbicide. That guideline kind of walks through that and how you address that. For those real weedies people of you, there's for $65, you can get the 1,700-page 2-book series called Weeds of California. They're all in there, great information. Not something you're going to use every day, but something I'd put on your bookshelf as a reference to help you out and confirm identifications and such. There's a Weeds Pest ID guide for Kindle. $18. Got lots of pictures. There's some pest ID cards for weeds also, $25. There's 49 different cards on those weed IDs, and it's got pretty good list of the major ones you'd find in pistachios. And then the other publication here is the Faurecia gilli one that's actually, I believe, sent with your packet for this course. So you have that if you wanted to see some more pictures and study up a little more on the Gill's mealybug. So that's pretty much a list of the resources. What I want to do now is just show you a couple of these things. Here is the pest management guidelines. And what I brought up here is the PDF version. Let's see here. Let's do this one and maximize. No, let me just kick this up. There. So this is the PDF version. Looks a little bit different than what you're going to get online or what you're going to get on your tablet. But you can see here in the introduction, just, guidelines to pesticides, what impacts they have on natural enemies and honeybees. Here's the properties of fungicides chart, fungicide efficacy chart, and treatment timing decision for key diseases. That can be really tricky. I'm in an insect world where you typically see an insect and then try to kill it. Realize that with diseases, oftentimes you're looking at weather models and things like that and trying to put products out there to prevent a disease from developing in the future. So it's more preventative than it is reactionary. And so this timing guideline can help you through that. Here's the insects and mites sections. You can see, flat mites, aphids, darkening beetles. Some of these we didn't cover during the course. Some of these, like navel orangeworm, are fairly detailed and up to date as of last year, including mating disruption information. So that's good. And I'm just going to kind of keep going. You can see weeds, vertebrates, and so on. And then I'm going to fast forward really quick here. Skip that. I'll come back to it. Relative toxicities. Okay, let's just pick a pest here. Pick a major one, not just one of these also-rans. False chinch bug. All right, let's do leaf-footed plant bugs. I just want to show you what's in here. So in each of these sections, here's an example of leaf-footed plant bug. You can see there's a description. So this section is always going to tell you how do you identify the insect. There's pictures there, typically pictures of egg masses, pictures of nymphs, pictures of adults, and so on for each different pest. Then there's a damage section. So what exactly do they do? Why should you care? How do you identify that damage? There's a management section that typically starts off with a couple sentences that just summarizes what to do. And then that has more detailed information broken down into biological control. In this case, talks about egg parasitoid. Cultural controls. How do you monitor for the particular pest? And then how do you make decisions about what to do to treat for it? And then there's always pesticide information. So this would be a list in the order of IPM, what's recommended. We always try to balance the order of these. Sometimes you have really, really effective products that maybe obliterate biological control. Or maybe you have really safe products on biocontrol, but they're only partly effective. So what the authors have done is try to balance these in the order of just all of that combined usefulness in an IPM program. In this particular case for leaf-footed bug, there aren't really soft products that are effective. And so it really comes down to the pyrethroids. But as you go from pest to pest, you'll see how they're ordered. There's typically comments if there's any particular warnings or things you need to know for each product that are available on these pesticide lists. So that's the strength of those guidelines. Again, they're free online. I encourage you to use those. And then lastly, I'm going to show you a close-up of the year-round checklist. Here we go. So Pistachio year-round IPM program. This is available in those pest management guidelines that I showed you, but I put it up here as a separate document. And this is the one that tells you what to do by time of year. So it literally is a checklist. So you can see here, dormancy to delayed dormancy. What should you be doing? Okay, so you should be pruning, just kind of, Yeah, so you should be pruning your trees. When you're pruning, you should be looking for Botryopspheriae cankers. Okay, you should be doing sanitation for navel orangeworm mummies, getting those on the ground. You should be, destroying those nuts, and so on. Okay, well, so once that's done, go ahead and check the box for that orchard. As far as orchard floors, surveying. What did you find? What's your history? You should be putting on your pre-emergent herbicides. You should be catering that to what herbicides you have. You should be mechanically getting rid of leaves and debris from the area you're going to treat, especially if you're trying to get a pre-emergent right on the ground. Little information about some nozzles and scouting related to weeds. So you can see that, right on down the line. Those are all the things you should be doing during that period of time. Then it moves on to fruit development, moves on to bud break through bloom, fruit development sections, and pre-harvest, and then harvest and post-harvest. Okay, so it's great. This is not meant to be a provides all the information document. In most cases, if you pull this up online, what it's going to do is it's going to say, monitor for mealybugs, look for sooty mold on the leaves and mealybugs in the cluster, but it'll actually have a link directly to the pest management guideline on the mealybugs. So you can get more information that in the guideline, being guided there by this checklist. So we hope you take advantage of this. Really should help you out. And then, just lastly, realize that we're here to help you. PCAs can help you. I hope all pistachio growers have a PCA, but at the same time, we at UC Cooperative Extension can help you if it's a weed question, if it's an insect question, if it's a nematode question, we've got the resources. So feel free to call your local farm advisor or email them. We're working remotely these days with COVID in most cases. At the same time, we are still accessible. So, please take advantage of that. So with that, I think that pretty much wraps up the major resources out there. As I said, there's a lot of them. Hope you take advantage of them. And with that, I think pistachio growers and PCAs should be in very good shape. And one really last thing, the book I mentioned, I kind of highlighted it from a pest management perspective, but I just want to point out that book, that production manual, it's not an IPM to pistachios book. It is a pistachio production manual. So in addition to all those great chapters on pest management I referenced, there's also a bunch of great chapters on economics and pruning and all the other production sides of things that are out there. So please get it, please take advantage of it, and thank you very much.
Thanks. We have a poll. I'm going to launch it right now. It's 3 questions. Please go ahead and answer. We'll give it about a minute and a half here. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results if you could go over them, David.
Awesome. All right. So I love the answer to the first. I wonder why 9% of you said no. I'm hoping I can convince you to change your mind. But again, that's the best book that's going to be out there to help you out. The next question, 2, UC's year-round IPM plan and how it's organized. Okay, so the first answer by pest type, that's false. Okay, if you want to get information by pest type, you should go to the pest management guideline. Okay, and then the third one is correct. Okay, the year-round IPM plan, that's the one that's actually by the different periods of the year, delay dormant, and so on. And then lastly, yeah, that's an all the above. All of those are great resources. So please take advantage of them. So yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, well, thank you, David. I don't see additional questions here, but I think we do have still a little bit of time, about 5 minutes or so before going to the next presentation. So if anybody has any questions to to David at this point, you can directly ask him also. So we'll, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Another 5
So,
minutes.
so how about this? I'll answer Brent's question, and then I don't know if you want to take a minute and let Brad answer a couple of questions that he had. I can give my time to him. But so Brent, the question is contact information for UC people. So if you go to ucanr.org, okay, ucanr.org. That's the University of California's Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources website. Click on find people, or there's I can't remember exactly what it says, but there's basically a people link. If you click on that, there's a directory there. Every single person employed anywhere in the state by the university's Division of Ag and Natural Resources, that includes all the specialists, all the IPM advisors, all the farm advisors, all of their emails and phone numbers are located at that website. So that one's the easiest.
Brad, do you want to, if you're still there, there are a few questions if you want to address them.
Put me on the spot. I've been furiously typing and dodging the hard ones.
Sorry.
So I answered most of them there's a couple of specific ones. I saw one from Paul. It just came in about a specific label question. I'd have to look up the label on the Chateau. The question was about a 3-year wait. Look up the details on that. I believe Chateau is a 1 year, but definitely look that one up. I don't have the labels memorized. There was a question, Merdad, I think, was asking about one of the slides I skipped over, which I believe, I don't have the handouts in front of me, but I think that was the one about herbicide application considerations. And really, that's just be very thoughtful about what it is that you're trying to do. Know what the weeds are, know what the label recommendations are, whether it can, what it works on, whether you need to have a tank mix that goes with that. If there are weeds present, you're going to probably need to control the existing weeds before you're going to get satisfaction out of your pre-emergent herbicides. Surfactants and adjuvants, almost all the post-emergent materials require some kind of surfactant or adjuvant or water conditioner to increase the efficacy. I think really the take home of this is just to be really cognizant of what the tools are and how best to make them work for weed control, and how to minimize the potential for for non-target effects, crop injury, off-site movement, environmental damage. So this is really, just being smart about what you're doing, and this is, I think this is my PCA shaming and farmer shaming plug here is, you guys, we all have responsibility to use our weed control tools appropriately. And if we don't, they'll be regulated in such a way that they'll be difficult or impossible for us to use. So do a good job of it. Paul asked about whether people use diesel as a sticker. If they do, they don't do it legally. That's not a registered product, and I do not recommend that. Let me see. And then there were several questions, a couple I answered, a couple I didn't, about potential crop injury. And really, almost all the herbicides we use in pistachios can injure pistachios. The safety comes from keeping them below the leaves and above the roots. And anything that we do as an applicator that causes drift into the canopy, we can get some crop response. Or if there's soil or rate or environmental issues that result in that herbicide moving too deeply to where the pistachios can pick it up, we can get injury. So again, this is really where it's important for us as applicators and advisors and farmers to be very cautious, number one, about, don't go crazy on the rates, even if it's legally allowed, and use the herbicides at the right time, at the right rate for your weeds and your soil conditions. So I think it's just be very careful about how we use the tools. Question here about volatility. And Paul mentioned Goal specifically. There are a few herbicides that have some degree of volatility, and oxyflorphin EC formulations are probably the most volatile that we use. So we can, anything that really smells like chemicals, it's often a volatility of either the AI or the formulation, the emulsifiers. So we can get some foliar burn from Goal if it moves as a volatile. Most of our other herbicides are not very volatile. 2,4-diamine has some volatility issues, which is why we tend to not use that during the growing season. But volatility tends not to be such a big issue with herbicides. Spray drift is a much bigger problem, far greater problem than volatility. I think volatility gets blamed a lot for what's actually sloppy applications. So I'll stop. I see Jalindra coming on.
Okay, well, thank you, Brad, and thank you, David. I think we will move on to our next topic and speaker here. So our next topic is about step-by-step guide to field diagnosis related to Pistachio. And the speaker is Dr. Richard Hirima. He's with the New Mexico State University Department of Plant Science. So I'll welcome Dr. Hirima on this presentation here. So thank you.
Thank you, Jalindra. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. I also want to thank I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to present again at the UC Davis short course for pistachios. I've presented a number of times, and you know, really this is it's kind of like going home again. I'm from the San Joaquin Valley, grew up in the northern San Joaquin Valley, so it's definitely definitely home for me. Here I'm actually literally in my home as well, in New Mexico. So it's a little bit of a irony there, I suppose, as well. All right, so the topic I've been asked to present on is a step-by-step guide to field diagnostics. And so really the goal that I have in presenting this is to give you an idea of how you go about finding out what's wrong in an orchard when you see something you don't recognize at all. Okay, so how do you figure out what is causing the problem that you're seeing? So first of all, we need to have kind of an understanding of what are the sorts of things that can cause any sort of disorder that you might see. And I'm sure in some of the previous presentations, you've already seen some of these things, but I think we can divide all of the causal agents for a disorder into two broad categories. There are the biotic disorders and the abiotic disorders. We just saw presentations on some issues dealing with biotic disorders, right? So biotic disorders, living organisms that cause problems. So fungi land in that category. So Bactrosphaeria, for example, bacteria may cause some issues. Viruses may cause some issues, phytoplasma, nematodes, insects and mites, and vertebrates can cause disorders, right? Those are all biotic causes. Abiotic disorders are those causes that are non-living, those causal agents that are non-living. So for example, oil moisture extremes, too much water, not enough, temperature extremes, too hot, too cold. Salts, boron, excess boron, excess chloride, those can cause issues in orchard crops, including pistachio. And again, it could be too much or too little, right? Air pollution may be an issue sometimes. Wind or light effects may cause problems. Mechanical damage, maybe from even equipment. And then pesticide injuries. So that those would be abiotic disorders. All right, so I gotta make sure. Okay, so one point that needs to also be made is that abiotic disorders might predispose your plants, your trees in this case, to the biotic disorders. So some of these environmental stresses may actually make the trees more susceptible to diseases or to insect problems. I don't show that on the figure, but actually the opposite is true as well. That some biotic disorders might predispose the trees to abiotic disorders. All right, so to give you a little bit of an idea of how we go about the diagnostic process, we have to first bear in mind that diagnosing disorders is a process. Okay, there's multiple steps, and it's a team effort. Okay, So we need to get more than one group or more than one person involved in the whole process. Sometimes having that single-minded approach, the very narrow-minded approach that we might go into the question with, it might not be enough. Getting more than one perspective is always good. So that might be the consultant, pulling in a consultant to help us out, pulling in a farm advisor or an extension agent, pulling in the help of a diagnostic clinic. That will give us a broader perspective, help us to get an accurate diagnosis. Also, we need to make sure that all of our conclusions are derived from critical evaluation of the trees and the environment, both. Okay, so not just looking at one very narrow thing on the tree, just looking at the leaves or just looking at the fruit, but look at the whole picture. Okay, and all of this will require a good blend of good observational skills, science, and experience. I sort of hinted at this already, but make sure that you don't jump to conclusions. Keep an open mind to the possibility that what you're seeing is not the first thing you've found on Google. Okay, so don't jump to conclusions. Be a detective. So put on your detective hat and observe, question, gather clues. Again, don't jump to conclusions. It's often not the first thing you find on Google. Evaluate the whole plant. I already said this, the whole orchard and the areas around the problem area. That's something that's getting a big picture. Okay, and when possible, dig up and look at roots, cut open stems, branches, fruits, etc. So look, don't only look at the things that are above ground. Look at what's underground. Don't only look at the outside of the plant. Look at the inside of the plant if that's possible. Okay, the first step. The first step in diagnostics is to spot the problem. We need to know there is a problem if we're going to if we're even going to try to diagnose it. Okay, so and that really involves observing it. Observing gives the idea that you actually can physically see the problem, and sometimes it's not something that you can see with the eyes. Sometimes it may be something that can only be detected with specialized instruments or by looking at yield records, things like that. But you still need to observe in whatever way possible that there is a problem with the trees. We need to know, in order to spot a problem, we need to know what a healthy and normal appearing tree should look like. And we ought to be able to tell what the differences are between cultivars. Okay, and we need to familiarize ourselves with the symptoms of disorders. Now, this is a point that it doesn't seem terribly exciting, especially in this world where technology is becoming more and more important. I don't want to minimize the importance of having technology to assist us, but we shouldn't accept all of these new technological advances without maintaining the important old-fashioned ways of observing problems in an orchard. Okay, so nowadays we have systems where we can actually sit in our office and we can see exactly what the soil moisture in our orchard block is. Okay, that removes us from the orchard and puts us in a position where we might miss something entirely. We're not seeing it, and so we may miss something important. We need to physically be in our orchard on a regular basis. And now more than ever, we need to make a point of doing that. And I'm not just talking about driving around the periphery of the orchard. I mean, getting into the orchard and looking closely on a regular basis. Okay, so we need to get that on our calendar, that we need to actually physically be in our orchards on a regular basis. Okay, also, now that we know that we're trying to spot the problem, we're looking for symptoms. And again, symptoms, I'm using that term maybe a little more broadly than we usually would. It may be things such as a yield, a loss in yield. It may be something that you can't see on a leaf, but requires looking at the plant in a different way. But these symptoms usually develop because the causal agent produces a toxin or enzymes or growth regulators that then interfere with the specific cellular functions of that plant. And the reasons why symptoms are useful is because those specific cellular functions are then associated with the symptoms that we see. Okay, and that gives us really important clues into what might be causing the problem we're seeing, and then ultimately helping us to find a solution to the problem. But symptoms are not without problems. There are a number of reasons, and I'll go through these one by one. Problems with using symptoms alone. Okay, so first of all, symptoms don't stay the same. Okay, so sometimes as a disease or a disorder progresses in time, the symptoms change dramatically. Okay, and it might not just be worsening; they may change completely. Okay, symptoms can vary with the severity or virulence of the causal agent. Okay, they can vary with the tree's age or growth stage. So the time of year might matter. They vary due to environmental conditions during and after the infection. Symptoms are not always specific to a causal agent. So sometimes you may see interveinal chlorosis, one of those situations where the leaf is chlorotic, it's yellow, but there's green between the veins. Okay, that symptom, we might say it's iron deficiency, maybe it's manganese deficiency, maybe it's exposure to a herbicide. Okay, again, we need to know more than just that the symptoms are there, but it's a good hint, right? It's a good clue that leads us in the right direction. Helps us eliminate a number of possibilities. We know navel orangeworm damage does not cause that particular symptom. Okay. Causal agents often affect more than one plant process at a time. So sometimes there might be more than one symptom associated with a causal agent. So cold injury may cause damage at more than one level, depending on the stage of the plant. That's an example of that. Plants may be affected by more than one causal agent at the same time, and they might be abiotic and biotic. I already pointed out that these different abiotic disorders may actually cause the plant to become more susceptible to the biotic, and that affects the symptomology. The bottom line here is symptoms are not usually enough for diagnosis. Okay, of course, when you're typing a symptom into Google, it's going to point you into just one or a few different things. And so, again, don't jump to conclusions based on the symptoms. The second step in diagnostics is to gather accurate and complete information. Okay, make sure that all of your information is accurate and complete. Okay, so you need to get an idea of the situation of the orchard, the history of that disorder, if possible. You need to learn about the spatial variability of the symptom within the orchard block and the symptom expression within the individual trees. Okay, the sorts of information that you might need as far as the situation of the orchard itself, and if you're a PCA or if you're a consultant, you may not know these things, and you'll have to visit with the grower. The cultivar, the rootstock. Okay, you need to know that certain rootstocks are more susceptible to salinity, for example, or to cold injury. Okay, and it's very important that you know whether the rootstock is clonal or whether it's a seedling. Okay, all of these things are important. Age and production history. So we need to know how old the trees are. We need to know when they went into production and whether the yields were at a high level or a low level, whether there's alternate bearing in that orchard. These are all important factors. Soil textures and other soil characteristics are really important. Maybe get on to the NRCS page and have a look at the soil maps from that particular site. Get an idea of what the soil textures are. Get out in the field and actually look at the soil textures as well. The maps are not 100% perfect every time. The cultural practices. You need to have an idea of is this an organic orchard? Is this an orchard where particular herbicides were used? Also, the weather conditions before and during symptom development, that's important in order to spot whether or not the weather might have something to do with the symptoms appear. Those are important factors. Historic land use of the orchard site. This is one that oftentimes we might miss. Was there a dairy farm located there before the orchard was planted? Important factors to consider. The land use in adjacent properties. Is there a crop that may have served as a host for a particular pest in pistachio located right next door? Soil and water analyses are important, and leaf tissue nutrient analyses. To give you an idea of this big picture, I've shown this before, and I got this from Louise Ferguson, but this gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of process that you might go through. In real life, you would spot this instantly, but if we see a situation like this where certain trees in the orchard are growing far less vigorously than other trees. You see how one row in this orchard block is much less vigorous than the row right next door. Okay, if we knew that these were both Kerman on UCB1, would both of these rows, and if we knew that they were treated exactly the same way, and we knew that the soil textures were not different, we'd be left wondering with this picture exactly what's going on. Right? We'd be left wondering. However, if the cameraman had taken this picture just slightly differently, we would have the answer immediately. Of course, this is a simple thing to diagnose, but I think it demonstrates very clearly how if you jump to conclusions based on just the information you have without looking at the broader picture, you might miss something really, really important. Okay, let's move on a little bit with the critical information needs that we're going to be gathering this in the second step. What about the history of the disorder in that orchard? We need to ask the question, when did this problem begin? Or when were they first noticed? That's more often actually the truth of the matter. When were they first noticed? Was this a problem that the grower had been dealing with for a very long period of time? Is this, if this is an orchard we just purchased, did the previous manager also deal with this problem and just ignored it? So those are possibilities, and we need to know the answer to that. It'll help us in figuring out exactly what the problem is. We need to ask the question of whether these symptoms are spreading. Is it moving through the orchard, and how quickly is it moving through the orchard? Okay, that might help us decide whether it's an abiotic disorder or a biotic disorder. Is it moving from tree to tree, or is it moving, and is it also moving to other plants in the orchard? That helps us figure out what's going on. And when we look at that orchard, is there spatial variability in that orchard that might tell us some things about what the problem might be? Okay, so what percentage of the orchard is affected? Is it a large percent? Is 90% of the orchard affected, or is it only 1%? That's an important factor. And is that changing? Is the symptom pattern, is it scattered throughout the orchard or clumped up into where trees next to each other also have the problem? Or is it just random? Is there some sort of a pattern, or is it random? And again, are other plants in the orchard also affected? The weeds, for example, or plants along the edges of is there a cover crop that's affected? These are questions that will help us. So I'll give you a few aerial images and a couple other photos that might show the sort of things that you might look at. These images are taken from Google, but you could take these sorts of images from an airplane or from a drone as well. But Google's great. It's a great way to see some patterns in your orchard. So if you look in this image, you'll see that there are some yellow trees, and these are pecans, not pistachios. But you can see that up in the upper right hand corner, there's a yellow tree, and then you'll look further down on the right hand side, you'll see there's a couple yellow trees that are next to each other. At the bottom of the image, there's another yellow one. I would call this a mostly scattered type symptomology, right? So you see the symptoms appearing in scattered. This might lead us to start looking for an abiotic cause for this. And you can see that some trees have only partial canopy affected. This is a scattered, and it might lead us to look at the soil types in these various places. It might make us look and see if maybe there's a different rootstock in certain places. Or we might see something that's more clumped like this. Okay, this is a pistachio orchard in Arizona, and you can see big clumps of trees that have died in this case. This happens to be verticillium wilt that's causing this issue. Here we see a pattern where the upper edge of the image is at the you see a lot of dead trees on the upper edge of that, and it becomes less and less problematic as you move to the bottom of the image. Turns out that this particular field is a flood irrigated. It's pecan orchard again. It's flood irrigated, and the water moves from one end to the other, and it's very likely due to an irrigation problem. Here's another image where you see unusual patterns. If you were to look at the NRCS data, you would find that this matches up quite nicely with a clay streak right in that orchard. How about in something like this? What might cause something like this, where the tree on the left is completely dead? The tree in the middle of the image is half dead. See that it has half of its branches dead. The other half look fine, and then the tree on the right looks just fine. This is a very clear example of a herbicide drift type damage. And so then you can see that how important that is to an idea in the plant itself. The plant parts all affected equally, are which parts are affected and which are not? Is the pattern top down or bottom up? Where's the primary side of the injury? And is the progression of the severity on the plant, is there a progression in the severity of the plant over time of those problems? So I'm gonna move through this kind of quickly, and you can. So when you're looking at leaf symptoms, so we're kind of moving back to the symptoms again. Is there uniformity, or are there patterns? So you can actually follow that same sort of thing that we talked about earlier, looking at the whole field level. You can look at the leaves within the canopy. Is there spread or growth? Again, we're asking all these same questions, but about the leaves themselves. Are the margins or borders of the leaves? Do we see some sort of a burn there, or is the symptom worse along the edge? Are there fruiting bodies? That tells us something about that. So I'm going to skip through these. Finally, the third step, and that is to collect specimens. So if we haven't already figured out with certainty what exactly we're doing, I would suggest at this stage that it's really important to collect specimens and get a plant diagnostic clinic involved. Okay, these clinics may be privately run or state run. So we have, with New Mexico State University, we have a plant diagnostic clinic that receives samples from around the state of New Mexico, and will receive samples from other states as well. But there are similar labs in Arizona as well as in California, where specimens can be shipped for an accurate diagnosis. When you collect specimens, these specimens should be kept fresh, refrigerated. Okay, we don't want to send in a sample that has deteriorated to the point where it's not useful anymore. Submit samples that are showing all stages of the problem. Okay, so if you can see different stages of the problem, collect that. And sometimes your lab may want to have some photos of the situation as well. When you're pulling in this individual into your team, the lab is going to be, they might want to see all of these same things, all of the same information that the rest of the team is looking at. In some cases, it may be best to collect the whole tree. Okay, I would say in the case of mature orchards, that's probably not going to be useful. But although I have seen pretty large trees sent into our own plant diagnostic clinic. Sometimes I'm hauled in on a flatbed truck, but that's pretty rare. Usually in the case of when a whole tree is sampled, then it'll be an immature tree. You need to collect samples from all the affected organs on the tree. So if there are symptoms that are seen on stems, and there are symptoms seen on fruit, and there are symptoms seen on leaves, be sure to collect all of those things. As you're sampling, make sure that you don't destroy any of the signs or symptoms that may be of interest to the lab. If you collect roots, you should remove the soil. Include tissue both above and below any visible lesions that you might see on roots. And the same for stem and leaf type samples. So be sure to collect tissue both above and below any visible lesions, so that the lab can see that margin between healthy tissue and sick tissue. And for flowers, for fruits, seeds, if that's where the symptom is, be sure to collect the entire organ for the lab. When you're sending in the sample, be sure to identify and label every specimen carefully. Make sure that it says what species it is, make sure it says what cultivar it is, where the sample was collected, which field it was collected, so that you can go back and determine where the sample came from. And then package that into a sturdy box. When it's going through the mail, it could easily get squished, and you could destroy some of the important symptoms or signs that the lab could use. Do not add water or wet paper towels. Okay, so sometimes in an attempt to hold to keep everything fresh, people want to wrap up the samples and keep them wet. That's oftentimes not a good choice, particularly if it's an abiotic. If it's a biotic disorder and possibly caused by fungi or bacteria, that could really cause some problems. Ship your specimens as soon as you can. Don't leave your samples laying on the dashboard of your truck for any period of time. Make sure it gets shipped as quickly as possible, and ship it overnight. So ship it fast to the laboratory. Oftentimes with many laboratories, it's better to ship it earlier in the week. And the reason for that is if it shows up late on Friday, it might not get looked at until sometime Monday. And so if you want the lab to look at it quickly and to make sure that they can store it in a refrigerator, make sure that you send it earlier in the week. With that, I am ready to take any questions if there are any. And that's all I've got for you right now.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we'll have a poll question first.
We actually do not. For this presentation, there is no poll, so you could go right on into the questions.
Okay, well, so thank you so much for your presentation. We appreciate your contribution. Let's see whether we have, certainly we have questions, but I'm trying to find out the first one first rather than going in here. Okay, so the first question that I see here is, where are the pistachio and pecan in New Mexico? Is it like, I think that someone wanted to know a little bit more about where it's grown and what the area is.
Yeah, okay. So most of the pistachios and pecans they're grown in some of the same areas. It's the southern half of the state at an elevation of 3,500 to close to 4,000 feet, even a little higher than 4,000 feet for some of the pistachios. It's so most of the acreage is located near Alamogordo, New Mexico, which is say about an hour and a half drive from Las Cruces, New Mexico, if you're familiar with the state. So that's where most of the pistachio production is. Pecans a little bit more widespread across the southern half of the state, mostly in Doñana County near Las Cruces. So it's a great environment for growing both of these crops.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, we have very slow growth in replanted baby trees. Any clues? Most of these replantations are because of the old dead trees.
Okay, yeah. So again, so the symptom in this case is very slow growth. There are probably hundreds of different reasons why slow growth might be occurring. So it could be related to the genetics of the rootstock. It could be related to mineral nutrition or water relations issues, irrigation problems. Because it sounds like there was removal of another tree, it may actually be competition between adjacent larger trees. Okay, so that's often the case when you replant a brand new nursery tree into a mature orchard, that the competition between adjacent mature trees is too much for the small tree. So that's just a guess. But again, this is actually a great demonstration of the need for getting a bigger picture of exactly what's going on.
Okay, thank you. I think there is one more comment. It looks like, Richard, we need to put our boots on the ground. We got to cast our shadow in and out of the farm. So I think it's in the farm. So I think it's more a comment. So
I agree 100%.
Okay, well, so far that's what I can see. But if anybody has any direct question to Richard, you can raise your hand, or you can directly speak at this point.
And I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping announcements. So if you are in attendance in this meeting, you are going to get emailed a quiz for the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. You do not have to take the quiz if you do not want credit. Everyone will get a certificate of completion for the entire course unrelated to DPR, so you don't have to take these tests to get that certificate. This is only for California Department of Pesticide Regulation. For Certified Crop Advisor, you can go ahead and scan the QR code that's on the screen now. You would open the application, the California Certified Crop Advisor application on your smartphone, and just, scan the QR code. If you don't have that app, you can email ANR program support and I will physically add you. That's that. The last kind of announcement is our next day of the course is on Monday. It starts at 8. Make sure you're here on time, because about 5 minutes before we do some announcements about what continuing education credits there are that day and so forth. So those are the remaining course dates. I will put the QR code back on the screen and leave it up there for now. If you have a question, we'll stay on for another about 5 minutes. Type it into the Q&A for Richard, and then we can address it there. Otherwise, we'll stay on for a couple more minutes just to do that. If you are ready to go, you can sign off. Thank you for coming.
Okay, well, thank you for all the speakers today: Chris Tollerup, David Haviland, Roger Baldwin, Brad Hansen, Richard Hirema, and also would like to thank all the participants today. And yeah, I think Kelly mentioned we'll be here for a few more minutes if there is any questions, any concern, any questions on that. So thank you.